In this video, we will be covering the deepest tiers, the final episode of the World War II Iceberg. From the high-up SS officer who ended up working for Mossad, and who was dubbed Hitler's most dangerous man, or the plan by the Americans to attach these tiny little bombs to bats and just release them over Japan, a serial killer who worked under the cover of darkness in London during the war, to some of the most insane experiments, operations, hidden bases, experimental weapons, and the youngest soldier to fight in World War II. We will cover all of this and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is milk oolong tea, and join me as we explore the depths, the darkest tiers of the World War II iceberg. Operation Anthropoid was the Allied operation or the goal of assassinating Reinhard Heydrich, otherwise known as the Butcher of Prague. He was also known as the Hangman, as the Blonde Beast, as well as various other names, but he was one of Hitler's top officials and commanders, and he served multiple roles within the Nazi party. And this ranged from the head of various police forces to the deputy leader of the SS, the director of the Gestapo or the secret police, as well as various other roles. And he was seen by many to be one of the most evil men in the Nazi regime. And so it was planned by the Czechoslovakians to basically kill him. And this was during a planned visit to Prague, which was at the time under Nazi territory taken over by Germany. So they basically set a little trap for him. They had these two Czech soldiers ambush him as he was driving by, but a few things went wrong. Their gun ended up jamming, and so the other soldier snuck up to the car, kind of lobbed a grenade which was hidden inside of a briefcase. He lobbed this grenade at Heydrich's car, and this didn't end up killing Heydrich, but it did severely injure him. The two Czech men, the assassins, they did manage to get away, even with Heydrich chasing after them, firing his gun at them. And then soon, Heydrich collapsed somewhat nearby. He was taken to hospital, he was operated on, and he did seem to be making a decent recovery. Until suddenly, he just got up one day, he went into shock, and then he went into a coma, and then after being in this coma for 8 days, he did end up dying. And this attack was actually the only successful assassination attempt of a high-ranking Nazi official by a government. That being, of course, in this case, the Czech government. But this did lead the SS and the Nazis and Germany to massively retaliate against the Czech forces and the Czech population, with originally Hitler himself sanctioning the killing of 10,000 just random Czech people. He said, yeah, as collective punishment, just take 10,000 civilians and just shoot them dead. But this was eventually decided against, and instead they just did a massive investigation. They found out, who was involved in organizing it, in supporting it. They arrested around 13,000 people and killed around 5,000 people. And on top of that, this also led to the slaughter of Ladies, which the Gestapo basically thought, this wasn't true, but they thought that they had pinned Ladies, this little village, as being the birthplace of this assassination attempt. And they thought that the assassins had basically fled to Ladies and that they were either hiding in there at the moment or they had, escaped from there. And so the Gestapo marched into this village. They killed roughly 200 men. They deported 200 women, and they captured around 100 kids, many of them later being killed. They also attacked the village of Leszaki, maybe the Z is silent. The village of Liki. But they attacked this village because there was a radio transmitter found there that linked back to the assassins, and so they just attacked the entire village. All of the women and children from Leszaki were killed, and both of these villages were burnt to the ground and completely leveled, in an effort really to send a message to the Czech people. If you kill one of our people, one of our officials, we will absolutely destroy you. And apparently the Czech and British governments who, were in on this, apparently they didn't expect the Germans to go this far in retaliation. They thought, maybe they'll kill a few people, but they're not going to do much more than that. But from the German German perspective, absolutely you would go this far. Firstly, they needed to figure out, who killed one of your top German officials, who was involved in the planning, who knew about it and facilitated it, which explains why they arrested so many people, killed everyone they suspected of being involved in it. And they would probably need to send a message, because you can't just have your officials being killed whenever they're out and about. And so to stop this thing happening in the future, they would have needed to go this far. And so I think it would seem like a very obvious thing for the Germans to do. So I don't know how the British or the Czech didn't really see this coming. The Rambo of Quebec was one of the many very cool soldiers that we have and we will cover in this iceberg. But he was a Canadian soldier of Quebec, and if you've ever seen Rambo, Leo Major was known as the Rambo of Quebec, and I think he certainly did live up to that label. He would regularly, single-handedly take down entire groups of enemy soldiers. He, at one point in 1944, captured an armored truck, or tank, or truck tank. I mean, just look at this thing. It looks like it's a fusion of the two in some sort of evil German fusion experiment. But he captured this by himself. He killed the soldiers on board it, again by himself. And in the truck tank, he found some secret German codes and information. And this ended up being super useful to the Allied mission. Then, just a few days later, he snuck up on an SS patrol. He killed all of them in a 1 versus 4 fight. But at the last second, one of the soldiers was able to get off a grenade, which exploded and blinded Major in one eye. But this didn't really seem to bother him that much, because he said he enjoyed sneaking around, scouting, ambushing, sniping, and he said for all of these things and to sight his weapon, he only really needed his one eye. And he also said he looked pretty cool, he looked like a pirate, and so yeah, I can't really flaw his logic there. And then another time, while out on a recon mission, Leo was just sneaking around and he spotted around 100 German soldiers. They were all kind of in a camp. Most of them were sleeping, some of them were sitting around smoking or talking or chilling, 100 of them. And so the most obvious thing that you might do as a scout would be maybe to head back to your base to deliver the intel. That would certainly be incredibly helpful and effective. Or if he was feeling quite brave, quite aggressive, maybe he would sabotage them a little bit, maybe destroy some of their vehicles, shoot the men he could see, throw some grenades into camp or something, just cause general mayhem and chaos. But no. This is the Rambo of Quebec. And so being the man that he was, he basically snuck down into this nearby river. He swam through the river, sneaking up on the other side of the camp, and this was basically the only way that he could sneak past the camp without being seen. And then he eventually found the commanding officer somehow. He woke him up at gunpoint, forced him to surrender, and told him, "You are now my prisoner," and basically ordered him to wake up all of his other men, all the 100 men that were at the camp, and to tell them to surrender as well. So thankfully, the commanding officer then surrenders. He goes outside, he wakes up all of the other men, they end up surrendering. And Leo ended up shooting a few of the men, likely, I think, because they were being a bit not surrendery. But the men all surrendered at the order of their commander. They gave up their weapons and they were accompanying Leo back to his camp as now prisoners. And this is when the entire group of around 100 soldiers and Leo was spotted by another group of SS soldiers who basically saw the Germans surrendering, and they were like, no, we cannot have that. And so they opened fire on both the Germans and on Leo, killing 7 of them and injuring many more. But he did soon make it back to the Canadian lines, and he instructed a nearby passing Canadian tank to open up fire on the SS troops who were attacking him. And with that, he safely marched back into camp with the remaining 93 German prisoners. And for this, he was given the DCM, or the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is basically just kind of one step below the Victoria Cross, which is the British equivalent of the American Medal of Honor. And I mean, I say he was awarded this medal, but in the end, he wasn't really awarded it because he was actually just offered the medal. Or, he had the option of taking the medal, but he actively turned it down because he said the guy awarding the medal to him, who was a man named General Montgomery, he said he was bloody incompetent and absolutely useless and was in no position to be handing out medals. So even though he could have taken this medal for himself, he was like, no, I don't respect the guy giving it, so I'm just not even going to take it. So, like, the gall on this guy is just absolutely insane. Then, shortly after this, he's riding around in the back of a truck. The truck hits a landmine, killing the two guys up front, but only breaking both of Leo's ankles and his spine and knocking him unconscious. So as you do, he's recommended to stay out of the war, to recover. So of course, he just breaks out of the infirmary, travels off to say hello to his girlfriend in Belgium, and then heads straight back out into the front lines with 2 broken ankles and a broken spine. And at this point, Leo had been missing in action for like a little while, obviously going to see his girlfriend off in Belgium. And so when he came back to his old commander, he was like, yo, coach, put me back in the game. And even though the war was basically close to over at this point, he went out on one last mission and it would be an absolute doozy. And so basically you had this Dutch city of Zwolly. I'm sure I could look up this pronunciation, but this was the Dutch city of this. And it was at the time completely occupied by the Germans. And so Leo's job, along with a man named Wilfred Arsenault, who was at the time one of his best friends, they were tasked with basically sneaking into the city and doing recon work, how many Germans were in there, whereabouts they were positioned, what sort of patrols they had, what weapons they had, and then to report all of this information back to the command in order so that they could launch a decently effective attack on the city, securing the city and capturing it from the Germans. But while they were inside the city, Leo's friend was shot. He ended up dying there on the spot, and so Leo decided to basically take on this entire mission just as a solo mission, which as always, was perfect for the Rambo of Quebec. He shot the German soldiers who had shot his friend, and then he basically just sneaks around the entire city, he kills a few more, he captures a German soldier, he then forces him to take Leo to his leader, and so now he's with this German commander. He tells him that, look, the war is over. In a few hours, the Allies are planning on raining artillery down on this city, which, there's no real point of staying here. And so he tells the German commander, look, just leave. I'm not going to kill you. Just take all your men. Just leave the city. There's no shame in it. You can't really fight back against artillery strikes anyway. And the German commander actually listens to this. And in, once again, a ballsy show of confidence, Leo actually hands the commander back his gun and he sends him away. Then Leo basically roams around the city, assassinating random German soldiers he finds and just throwing grenades just all over the place, capturing other German soldiers, taking them prisoner. And with all of this gunfire, with all of these random explosions, the Germans do actually believe what Leo initially said, that the Canadians or the Allies were coming over and they were now invading the city. And so this really starts the Germans basically fleeing the city, with an estimated 500 to 1,000 of them actually leaving the city. And it's kind of funny because the Canadian artillery wasn't actually coming because they were waiting on Leo to get back with the recon information from the mission. And so Leo knew that if they just killed him right there, then there wouldn't have been any artillery, at least for, the immediate future. But after single-handedly evacuating the entire city, or I don't know if evacuating is the right word, he forced all of these Germans out of the city that they had complete control over. Then the very next day, after doing this, he got in contact with the Dutch resistance army within the city. They got the word back to the Canadians, and the very next day, they entered the city without firing a single bullet and without firing a single shot of artillery. And as Leo had planned, this kind of preserved a lot of the buildings in the city, which he thought were quite nice, quite historical, quite good looking. He didn't want, the Canadians to just rain artillery down, destroying everything. And honestly, someone should make a movie about this if they haven't already. Maybe starring Chris Pratt or something, or maybe Nicolas Cage. But Leo saw some more action in the Korean War, which wasn't too eventful, but after that, Leo settled down into a quiet family life and died in 2008 at the age of 87. And he was still, at that point, and always will be in the eyes of everyone, I think, who ever learned about him, one of the greatest one-man armies that ever fought in the war. Panzer Schokolade, or tank chocolate, was the name given to Coca-Cola, which was a chocolate used by the German troops that contained coffee, that contained cola nut, with obviously the coffee giving it caffeine and the cola nut giving it even more caffeine, which is actually where the name Coca-Cola comes from the cola nut, because the original recipe had cola nut extract in. But this Coca-Cola was basically intended to be given to the soldiers as, you know, a boost of caffeine to keep them alert while out on the battlefield, and it is still actually sold today. Like, you can actually still buy this Coca-Cola and eat it, and I actually have some here. So you can buy this online. It's not really too expensive at all, and it is wrapped up in this annoying plastic. And yeah, it's very cool. As you can see, it basically comes in a tin, and if I open up this tin, this is actually the first time opening it, but it comes with a little protective thingy-majiggy, and the chocolate pieces are kind of arranged like a pizza. And from what I can see, you basically have like, yeah, you have the top layer, and then below this layer, you also have the same layer of chocolate. So within one tin, you get two little chocolate pizzas, and I will actually give this a little try. That is very interesting. So I'm only going to have one because apparently one little segment is the equivalent of like a single coffee, or I think 2 segments might be. But since I've already had my coffee today, I would actually like to be able to sleep tonight. But the chocolate tastes, yeah, very high quality chocolate. So it tastes very chocolatey. It also tastes very coffee-y. Like like there's a really nice flavor of coffee in there. And I don't really know what cola nut tastes of, so I can't really comment on that, but it is genuinely a very nice chocolate. And yeah, so a very cool thing to pick up. It's the same one that they used in World War II. Maybe the recipe has been changed a little bit, but it's the same company, the same, you know, chocolate. And if you can imagine, even if 2 of these counted as one coffee, there are 16 total little segments in this little tin. So if you're out on the battlefield fighting in a war, you basically have the equivalent of 8 coffees in this little tin. So very cool. I will let you know how, you know, it affects me throughout the video, how hyped and energetic I feel, and also maybe how much I, you know, crash towards the end of the video. But that is Coca-Cola, and you can pick some up for yourself if you are also curious. The Cowra Camp escape was the largest prison escape of World War II, and it took place in Australia in 1944. And this is when over 1,000 Japanese prisoners of war basically rushed over these barricades, and they basically stormed over all of the security wire using these blankets that they threw down and their own bodies. They shouted "Banzai," which is Japanese for, it's basically like a charging cry. You know, as they shouted "Banzai," they stormed all of the Australian guards, armed with knives, armed with baseball bats and clubs with nails in them, just random bits of metal, hooks, sharp garroting wire, and just more or less any sort of weapons they could get their hands on. They set a bunch of the buildings on fire, and almost immediately 2 privates, Benjamin Hardy and Ralph Jones, they jumped onto these machine guns and just opened fire on all of the charging Japanese. And they obviously killed a bunch of the Japanese, but soon enough they were completely overwhelmed just by the sheer numbers. And bravely, just as they were being overrun and stormed and attacked, one of the last things that Private Hardy did before he was killed was to remove the bolt from the mounted machine gun and just throw it away. And so in the confusion, when the Japanese killed these 2 men, and when they took the machine gun, they started firing it, but nothing was working, and, you know, they didn't really know how to fix it. They didn't know that the bolt had been taken out. They didn't know where it was, you know. So basically, by this last act of removing the bolt, Private Hardy ended up saving countless lives if the Japanese prisoners would have used this machine gun on some of the other guards. Over 350 prisoners escaped. Many of them were killed or, you know, just took care of themselves to avoid being recaptured. So a very World War II Japanese thing to do. And yet, all of the survivors were captured within 10 days of the prison break. And thankfully, while the prisoners were out and about running loose, not one Australian civilian was attacked or killed. And this was, I think, mainly due to some of the ringleaders of the prison break having previously instructed everyone, all of the prisoners, not to attack any civilians, and at least in this regard, all of the prisoners kept their word. The Pied Piper of Saipan. Now, if you thought Leo Major capturing and forcing 100 German soldiers to surrender is impressive, or was impressive, then wait until I tell you about the Pied Piper of Saipan. And he was a very interesting guy. Literally, that was his name. His name was Guy, with his full name being Guy Gabaldon. He was of Mexican descent, but he had these close family friends when he was a kid. They were his extended family, as he used to call them, and it was a Japanese family. And so growing up, he would learn Japanese from them. He also would study Japanese. He would also learn about their culture and their customs, etc. And so when World War II came around, as you all know, this family, being Japanese, were all taken into internment camps. And as soon as he hit 17, Guy joined the US Marine Corps and was shipped off to the Pacific, where the US was looking to capture the island of Saipan. And this was a very important island to capture, as this would allow them to basically set up bases, and from these bases to launch a final proper attack on the Japanese mainland. But Saipan at the time was occupied by the Japanese, and it was looking like it was going to be an absolute bloodbath. The Japanese wouldn't surrender, and the Americans needed this island, so they all landed there. But on the very first night that Guy landed in Saipan, he basically, without the permission of his superiors, he left his post, he went out on his own, he found 2 Japanese soldiers, and he brought them back peacefully as prisoners of war. And his commanding officer was obviously massively upset. He said, you're 17 years old. You can't just leave your post like that and go out alone. This is stupid. And he said that he would face severe punishment for his actions. So naturally, Guy, the very next night, went out and did exactly the same thing. And this time, he snuck up to a cave, he shot the Japanese guards outside it, and he shouted into the cave in Japanese, saying you're completely surrounded. Just come out, surrender. We don't want to kill you. It's not dishonorable to surrender. You'll be treated very well as prisoners of war. And so that morning, he returned to camp with 50 additional Japanese prisoners. And his commander at this point was I could punish you, but he was pretty effective, and so he just decided to keep Guy on, to not punish him, and to have him keep on doing this, keep on performing as a solo act. And this was perhaps one of the best decisions that this commanding officer would probably ever make. Because the next day, Guy went out, he did the same thing, he captured 2 more Japanese guards and convinced them to surrender. And on top of that, he convinced them to head back to where they were guarding and to get all of the other men to surrender as well. And Guy returned to camp with over 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians, all surrendered with not a single shot fired. Well, apart from those guards that he killed, but mostly without firing a single shot. And for all of this, his commanding officer recommended that he receive the Medal of Honor. But he didn't receive this. I guess they thought, his work wasn't quite that impressive. He did go into enemy zones, he did capture some prisoners of war, but his Medal of Honor recommendation was basically downgraded slightly to a Navy Cross, which is the second highest ranking medal for bravery of the Marine and the Navy. Marcel Petiot was a French doctor, a very nice, very respectable man. He served in the First World War, he was a man of his country, and also he was a mass serial killer. Yep. And he had a very interesting early life. He was born in a place called Yonne, which is just south of Paris, and when he was a teenager, he robbed a postbox and was then arrested and charged with damage to public property and theft. So because of this, and because he seemed at the time a little bit loopy, he was ordered to undergo a psych evaluation, which he did, and his charges were then dropped because they said he had a mental illness. And we don't know too much about his early life outside of this. He may may or may not have been, a petty delinquent. The evidence for that is a little murky, but he eventually graduated from his school in Paris, served in the First World War where he was injured and had apparently a more extreme mental breakdown. And so he was sent to various rest homes to basically recover before he went back to war. And while in these homes, he was arrested for stealing bloody everything. He stole blankets, morphine, army supplies, wallets, letters, photographs, and was then subsequently jailed. He was then further diagnosed with more mental illnesses, but he was sent out to war again, and then he suffered another injury, and then he got sent home again, this time on a disability pension. And so with all of that war stuff over, after the war ended, he basically returned home, and he attended a special medical school for war veterans. He completed it in 8 months. He became an intern at the mental hospital in Évreux. I apologize to everyone who speaks French, but I do think it was a little bit ironic that you had a literal mental patient working in a mental hospital. It's like the joke of the patients running the asylum. But he did soon become a full-blown doctor, and all while this was happening, he was known for, performing these shady practices, these uncouth, immoral practices, like, for example, giving out doses that were way too high to people that he shouldn't be giving them to in the first place, to performing illegal medical procedures. But his story from here on out is a little bit wild. He was dating this lady, Louise Delavaux, and she went missing around the same time as he was seen one night secretly loading a large trunk into his car. And the case was never solved. Louise was classified as a simple runaway, and then he ran for mayor of this town here, which I'm going to struggle to pronounce this one, but let's go with Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, which I think that means the new town below Yonne. You can correct me if you speak French and you are watching this video. But he ran for mayor of this town, and while he was doing this, he paid for someone to disrupt the opponent's debates, and so he ended up winning the mayorship. So he was clearly a very immoral, underhanded individual for sure. Then, when he was mayor, he embezzled the town's funds, so more stealing, and was eventually suspended as mayor just a month later. He was then elected councillor of the area, and then lost his council seat because he was accused of stealing electricity from the village. And I don't even know how you do that. He then moved to Paris, built up a doctor's practice, and was again known as like the guy you go to if you needed anything, legal or otherwise. Fake death certificates, medicine you weren't legally allowed, fake medical notes exempting you from work or from war. Marcel provided all of this. He was also at this time briefly institutionalized for kleptomania, which is the condition of obsessively stealing stuff. And there's a reason you can't make any jokes with kleptomaniacs, because they always take things literally. And by this point, World War II was, just around the corner. Germany soon invaded France, and a bunch of French civilians were drafted for forced labor. So Marcel would sell these medical certificates that would say, yes, legally, as a doctor, I say that this man cannot work and he cannot do labor. Maybe he has a fractured ankle or a twisted eyelash, or he's got cannot work itis or something. It's very contagious, that last one. But he was also around this time over-prescribing substances to people, which in some cases got them very addicted. And just as 2 of these patients were about to testify against him, they just seemingly magically disappeared. So very suspicious, very strange. And then he discovered during the war a way to make lots and lots of money. And that was basically to set up an escape route for Germans or Jews or anyone looking to escape secretly from France. And he said he could arrange passage to basically anywhere in the world, and he would first take them along northern Spain, then over into Portugal, and then over into South America, and then, from there, the world is the limit. Except he had no such escape plan or escape line. He didn't have anything set up, he just told people that he did. And he took roughly 25,000 francs from each person for this, escape plan. And it's hard to convert this into modern day money because the exchange rate was different, inflation was different, the amount of stuff you could buy with certain amounts of money is different, varies massively over the last, 80 years. But it would have been around about kind of 10, 15,000 US dollars in today's money. And so it wasn't exactly cheap. But if that guaranteed your freedom, if that guaranteed your life, it was a very cheap price to pay. And so with this, he would basically lure people in, they would pay him the money, he would tell them, look, Argentina, for example, requires that everyone is inoculated against various diseases. And so he said, they're not going to let you in unless you're immune against this list of them. And he would then inject them with these inoculations, but they actually contained cyanide. And this cyanide then killed them. He would take all of their belongings, he would dispose of their bodies. And I say he didn't have an escape line, but he did have kind of a mini network set up that ended at him. So he had a few people working for him that would, find people who wanted to disappear, wanted to escape. The men recommended Petiot as a doctor, or, as someone that could help them escape. And eventually someone went undercover to one of these men. And soon these men were all arrested by the Gestapo, who were, furious that there was this secret escape line. People were fleeing the country. And so, they were arrested, they were tortured. And while being tortured, they told the authorities about this doctor. And so police went to the address, which was the home of Marcel Petiot. And they found a coal fire in the basement with multiple remains in. They also found scattered in the basement more human remains. They also found in the back garden, inside of a pit filled with quicklime, more bodies. And so they were like, this is very, very suspicious. And French authorities then arrested these men. And soon enough, these men told the authorities about Petiot. And on his property, upon doing a full search of it, they found 72 suitcases, 655 kilos of stolen property, including 1,760 pieces of clothing, which included, 20 wool coats, 90 dresses, 120 skirts, handbags, full men's suits, ties, dozens of pairs of socks, and also shoes. And these were all from his victims. So he took their money, he took their valuables, and then clearly just took absolutely everything else because he was a kleptomaniac. Like, who steals someone's socks? But Petiot wasn't caught in his house. He went into hiding, he grew out his beard, he changed his name, until he was eventually recognized at a train station and arrested. And on him, he had 32,000 francs, so a good few dozen thousand US dollars equivalent. And he had 50 sets of identity documents. And when he was taken in, when he was being charged with various crimes, his lawyer basically said that he was only killing bad guys. He was killing German collaborators. And then when the prosecution was like, actually, some of these bodies were like just regular innocent civilians, Marcel said, look, I'm part of various French spy and resistance networks. We are fighting against the Germans. I don't know why I said that in a German accent, but we are fighting against the Germans. That's a little better. And he said, I just have found these bodies here, and so I assumed that my resistance network had killed some of the French enemies, and I was just getting rid of the bodies, and I did not kill any of them. I honestly just love the French accent, even if I can't really do it. But that was his excuse, that he just found the bodies, he assumed they were enemies of France, and he was just disposing of them. And this was almost certainly just absolute nonsense, just a way for him to get out of prosecution. And, they did investigate this, but there was no real evidence of a large network or resistance that he was connected to. There was also various signs that he was the one doing the killing. And so he was soon convicted of killing for profit between 60 and 200 victims, profiting through them to the tune of millions of dollars, or, francs, but the equivalent of millions of dollars. And so he was put to death, being beheaded in May of 1946, just months later. The Silent Unseen were these special elite Polish paratrooper force created in Britain, strangely enough. They took 2,600 Polish army soldiers and they took them over to Britain and trained them, and over 600 of these 2,600 ended up completing their training. And then they secretly parachuted around 300 of them back into Poland to conduct various secret missions. And these men were very cool. They did everything from like general intelligence, spy work. They were also radio operators, staff operators. Some were trained in the use of tanks and anti-tank weaponry. Some were trained in spotting and creating forged and fake documents. It was a very mixed bag of skills. And the name for the men, the Silent Unseen, we're not entirely sure where the name actually came from. There are theories that say it could have been from the fact that various men, from the Polish army, they seem to seemingly disappear overnight because, they were taken away, they were sent up to do training in Britain, in Scotland. And so it's like, one night, all of these men just silently, unseemingly just disappeared. Or it could refer to the very sneaky, very clandestine nature of the group, and by extension of the men, with a lot of them being trained in covert operations. But whatever the name is referring to, it is either way, very, very cool. Lauri Torni was a very, very interesting Finnish soldier who actually fought under 3 different armies over the years. And these weren't armies of like the same country. It wasn't like the Finnish Defense Army and then he fought in the Finnish Offense Army and then the Finnish Neutral Army. Now, his story goes, he was born in Finland and fought in the Winter War, which was the war between Finland and the Soviet Union, the same one we covered from earlier, involving the White Death. And Torni performed quite exceptionally in this war, and so was promoted and sent to Austria to be trained for 7 weeks with the SS. Because at the time, Finland was kind of teaming up with Germany. They weren't fully on Germany's side, on the Axis side. But at the time, Finland was fighting the Soviets. Germany was also fighting the Soviets. And so, yeah, Finland was fairly neutral. They were somewhat neutral, but they now had a common enemy. Germany could help train some of their troops in order to help them fight against the Soviets. And so they were basically just helping each other. And so he went for 7 weeks down for some SS training. He got sent back to Finland, where he led a unit that specialized in basically getting behind enemy lines and inflicting tons of damage. And he was so effective at this, causing such high casualties and so much chaos, that the Soviet army actually placed a bounty on his head of the equivalent of like a few $100,000. So then a peace treaty was struck between the Soviets and the Finnish, and since Finland wasn't technically at war anymore, Lauri was basically without a job. So he did the obvious thing. He went to Germany for further training with the intention of basically becoming incredibly skilled and of eventually fighting back against the Soviets, in case they ever invaded Finland again, or in case the Finnish decided to make a offensive against the Soviets. But for whatever reason, after the training, he couldn't find his way back to Finland. He couldn't make his way back to Finland. I'm sure he knew where Finland was, but he couldn't get back there for whatever reason. He said, F it, I'll just stay and join the SS, I suppose. And that way he could fight the Soviets, but from Germany instead of from Finland. And that is exactly what he did. And after fighting in the SS, in the German army for a while, he was soon captured by British troops. He was put in a prisoner of war camp. He escaped this camp, and then he found his way back to Finland. And while he was here, he had some drama, shall we say, with the Finnish authorities arresting him, and then with him escaping, and then with him being arrested again, charged with treason for working with the Germans. And then he escaped again before he was once more arrested. And then finally, he was basically pardoned by the president of Finland. And then he went on this long journey from Finland and then to Sweden and then to South America. And while he was there, he actually met someone who he had previously worked alongside, or rather fought alongside. And this man told Torni that, hey, look, I've got this plan to get up to the United States, if you wanted to maybe come with me. And so Torni did. He ended up sneaking across the US border via a boat and eventually finding his way into Alabama. Then he traveled to New York, where he was helped by the Finnish American community. And this was in Brooklyn's Finntown, which, I've heard about Chinatown, but I guess a place called Finntown also exists. It's a pretty cool little concept, I think. But he got some minor work while he was up there. He worked as a cleaner, as a carpenter, but eventually he joined the US Army. And due to his skill, due to his intelligence, his tactical intuitions, he very quickly made his way into the Special Forces, where he basically taught a few things, skiing being one of them, as you'd expect being a Finlandian. He also taught survival, he taught mountaineering, and sneaky guerrilla tactics due to, his extensive experience and effectiveness behind enemy lines. And over the years, he stayed in the US Army. He was eventually promoted to captain and served in the 10th Special Forces Group in West Germany. And while he was stationed here, he took the time to visit some of his relatives in Finland, which I think is very nice. Then, when the 1960s came around, he actually served in the Vietnam War, receiving 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star Medal. And while there, he was doing a bunch of covert missions, covert operations, before his aircraft that he was in suddenly, mid-mission, just went missing. They were unable at the time to find the crash site, and Laurie was assumed dead, with him actually being posthumously promoted to the rank of Major and awarded the Legion of Merit and Distinguished Flying Cross medals. His remains were found and confirmed a full 30 years later, and he was buried at the Arlington National Military Cemetery in Virginia in the United States. And honestly, his story was just incredible. Like, look at these decorations he acquired over the years in various armies and fighting for Finland and then for the SS and then for the United States. It's honestly a little bit wild. I don't think he joined the SS necessarily for like moral reasons. He just wanted to stay in an army. His country wasn't really fighting anymore. He seemed to have appreciated the training that he got from the SS previously. And he also did a fantastic job while in the American army. And I think one of the reasons why so many of these armies were like so willing to take him on board and they promoted him pretty quickly was because he was just incredibly good at his job. He was very effective, he was very skilled and competent, and that is the strange story of Laurie Tawney. The Soviet Night Witches were an all-female regiment of the Soviet Air Force during World War II. And typically, although a bunch of Soviet women could fly, they weren't really allowed to be members of the Soviet Air Force. So a woman named Major Marina Raskova, who was an incredible pilot, she basically fought for this, she pushed for it, and eventually Stalin did allow women into the Soviet Air Force. And he even authorized the creation of 3 women-only divisions, being the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. And for these, thousands of women signed up. They took a year of intense pilot training, and they were often given uniforms of old men. So, you know, oversized jackets and pants, boots that were too large, etc. Because the Soviets simply didn't have women uniforms, as there had never really been women in the Air Force before. And it's really quite fascinating. The 588th Division, who were the night bombers, were nicknamed the Night Witches. And they would fly these rickety old planes, a coffin with wings, some would call them, because they were these very light planes made out of plywood. They could only reach around 90 miles per hour, and they carried 2 bombs, one under each wing. And because of the weight of these bombs and because of their low speed, they often had to travel fairly low, making them even more susceptible and easily spotted by the enemies. They also carried no parachutes in these planes because the added weight of the parachutes was deemed to be just unnecessary. It would impact the actual flying of the craft a little too much. And they were often flying low anyway, so I'm not sure how much parachutes would have actually helped anyway. But these planes did at least have some advantage. For a start, they were wooden, which means that they didn't really show up on enemy radar. They were light, which meant that the women could maneuver them a little bit more easily, you know, get them out of the line of fire if need be. And they were also somewhat slow, which you wouldn't think would be an advantage, but the top speed, 90 miles an hour, of their planes was actually higher than the stall speed of the German fighter planes, meaning that if a German fighter plane slowed down to chase or to shoot one of these planes, they would be flying so slowly that their planes would start to stall. And then they would, you know, either crash or they would need to speed up again, meaning that they couldn't really trail behind and follow these women. And the Night Witches were an absolute menace. They slept during the day, they flew their planes during the night, and they would just fly around, they would do recon, they would drop their bombs all at night, unseen, often unheard, and if you're not careful, the night witches might get you. And then, of course, after bombing the Germans all night, they would land their planes, they would cover the planes up, they would hide them, camouflage them, and they would go to sleep, and then they would do it all again the following night. And this particular unit flew approximately 23,500 combat sorties, or basically bombing missions, between 1942 and 1945. And they had this really, really cool tactic where, as you can imagine, if you're Germany, you have these certain, valuable roads, valuable railroads, maybe a warehouse or two, a fuel depot, that you really do not want to be bombed by these night witches. So what the Germans would do was they would often set up a perimeter, they would put down searchlights, kind of keeping an eye out for these night witches. And if they spotted them in the air, they would then shoot them. But what the night witches would often do would be to fly with 3 planes. They would fly the 3 planes towards their targets, and when they were spotted, 2 of the planes would fly off, in crazy evasive maneuvers, and then they would fly off in opposite directions. And the spotlights on the ground would naturally follow these other planes, and they would track them that way. But once the spotlights were distracted, the 3rd plane would come in, slowly, unseen, and they would fly in the darkness towards their target. And when they were close enough, they would actually turn off their engines, meaning that they were basically completely silent, except for the sound of like a soft gliding. And they would glide slowly down. They would drop the bombs over the target, and then they would start up the engines again. They would take off, and the women would normally do between 8 and 18 of these missions every single night, with this woman, Irina Sebrova, flying 1,008 of these missions in the war, more than any other member of the regiment. Nicholas Winston's hidden Kindertransports is probably a bit of a mouthful, but Nicholas Winston was a British stockbroker who arranged multiple trains of safe passage for mostly Jewish children from Czechoslovakia, which at the time was occupied by the Nazis. And these trains would take them eventually to the United Kingdom, and he would also arrange, a series of foster homes for all of the children. There were a total of 8 train journeys that he successfully arranged from Prague to London, all of which passed through Nazi Germany, and these train journeys in total rescued 669 children and found all of them homes. But his last train, scheduled for the 1st of September 1939, which contained 250 children on board, was on that day stopped by the Nazis as they had just invaded Poland and they were shutting down all of the borders. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany, and sadly, those 250 kids on that last train were never seen again. And nobody really even knew about this. Of course, some people did, but Nicholas never really told anyone about it, even really after the war. And it wasn't until around 50 years later that his wife found one of his scrapbooks. And she was like, what the hell is this? I've never seen this before. And basically in the book was his letters to his family, often to his mother, detailing what he was doing, at the time of World War II, and what he was planning, how the mission was going, etc. And also news clippings of all sorts detailing everything he did while out in Prague. And so in 1988, his wife found out about this. She brought it to the public about her husband's time during the war. And in 2003, the Queen of England ended up knighting him, making him now officially Sir Nicholas Winton for, all of the great work he did and all of the children that he ended up saving. Audie Murphy's one-man stand. So I know we've gone over a few really cool soldiers here in the Iceberg so far, but Audie Murphy really is, or was, something special. And he was actually, despite only being 19 at the time, the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II, and one of the most highly decorated soldiers in US history, receiving every single military combat award for valor available from the United States, and also some French and Belgian awards for bravery as well. And he grew up in a large family in Texas, the 7th of 12 kids. He left school at 5th grade to pick cotton to help support his family, and eventually when he was in his mid-teens, his mother died, his father had left the family, and So yeah, that was more or less his childhood. And when World War II came around, he was only 16 at the time. And so Audi faked his ID, making him appear a bit older because, he was too young at the time to enlist in the war. And after being turned down by the army, by the navy, the Marine Corps, in large part because they said he was too skinny, too underweight, he was eventually accepted by the army and sent over to Europe. And while he was there, he was given the nickname of Baby, due to him looking so young and boyish. But although he looked young and was fairly short at around 5'5" or 166 centimeters, and he was fairly skinny, he was still incredibly brave, incredibly intelligent and strategic, which got him the attention of many of his higher-ups. And he was soon promoted several times. He was awarded several medals of bravery, all for various missions he had fought in very successfully, very effectively. Like, for example, a few times he approached the enemy alone, under gunfire, killed a few of them, took 5 or 10 of them prisoners, secured the area on his own. Another time he was attacked by a sniper, he got shot in the hip, and then he just turned around, returned fire, killing the sniper in the process. Like, he was an absolute unit, and again, he was just only 19 years old. But the main event that this entry is in reference to was a time in the Colmar Pocket, which was an area held by Germany in France. And Murphy's job and his men's, as he was the acting commander of this company at this point in time, again at only 19 years old, but their job was basically to hold the Germans back and to not let them advance, or at least to slow down their advance. And it was a bit of an awkward position. Murphy basically decided to set up a first line of defense and then a second line a bit behind it just in case they needed to retreat. So soon the Germans did rush Murphy and his men, killing a few of them, hitting one of their tanks, setting it on fire. And so Murphy told all of his men, like, look, just retreat, go back to the second defensive line. And instead of retreating himself, he decided to stay on the field and to fire his rifle at them, the 250 odd Germans all storming his position along with 2 tanks. So he held them off for a bit with his rifle while he used his field telephone to order in artillery strikes on the Germans. Then after he ran out of ammo on his rifle, he decided to just run back to climb on top of the burning tank, which the Germans were actually avoiding because they thought quite wisely that the fuel inside or the ammo inside could catch fire at any moment and the entire tank would just completely blow up. But Murphy decided to jump on top of this tank to man the 50 caliber machine gun mounted to it, and he was also quite badly injured at the time on his leg. So he was bleeding massively from his leg. He was firing this machine gun. The tank was on fire. There was flames and smoke and everything coming out of it. And the German men were afraid to, advance much more because there was a machine gun trained on them. The German tanks were afraid to come up closely because of this burning tank, which might explode at any second. And so Murphy was just on the tank, just kind of ducking down, dodging enemy gunfire, firing his gun at the Germans when he could. He killed a bunch of Germans and he held them back for round about an entire hour. And in interviews, he later said that he didn't really mind being up here on top of this burning tank because he said the smoke from the fire helped him hide his position from the enemy. And since it was winter at the time, it was freezing cold. And he said due to the fire, this was the first time in weeks that his feet had been warm. But he continued to call down air support on the Germans. And after an hour up here, he ran out of ammunition for the 50 cal machine gun. He jumped off the tank, he ran back to his defensive lines with his men, and just as he jumped off, just as he was, a safe distance away, the tank then decided to explode. So couldn't have been timed any better, honestly. But after killing a fair few Germans, he and his men arranged a counterattack, and this was quite successful. They pushed the Germans further back, they pushed the German tank back, and Murphy didn't stop a single time, still bleeding from the leg. So then after all that, he said, yeah, I'm not going to an infirmary or anything. I'm staying on the field, I'm staying in the fight. But he did allow some of the medics to, stitch up his leg to fix his wound a little bit at least, and then he just went back on fighting. And it was estimated that during this solo stand that Murphy probably killed around about 100 men in that hour between the rifle and machine gun fire and the artillery strikes. And for this, he won the highest American honor available, or military honor available, the Medal of Honor. And his later life was kind of a mix, honestly. He got into acting, he starred in a few films, one of which being To Hell and Back, which was actually a film based on his time during World War II, and starred him as himself, which is pretty cool. And he also starred in some Western films, but throughout his life, he also suffered from PTSD from his time in the war. He was said to have slept with a loaded pistol underneath his pillow all the time, and he also suffered from some pretty bad mental health problems. And in 1971, when he was just 45, he was flying in a private plane out in Roanoke in Virginia, when the plane crashed into the side of a mountain, killing everyone on board. He was buried a few weeks later with military honors, and his grave at the Arlington National Military Cemetery is actually the second most visited grave in the entire cemetery, just behind that of JFK. So yeah, a pretty cool dude, a very, very brave man, and the most decorated soldier in US history, and a movie star. Yeah, Audie Murphy was an absolute legend all round. The Land Cruiser was honestly insane. It was this proposed hypothetical 1,000-ton tank planned by the Nazis to be made during World War II. And at that weight, it would have been 5.5 times heavier than the heaviest tank they ever made in World War II, being the Panzer VIII Maus, which weighed around 188 tons. But the P-1000 Rat was proposed as a theoretical tank, and when Hitler learned about this theoretical tank, he just absolutely fell in love with it. And this tank was absolutely insane. It was like a small building or something. It had plans to have all of these crazy guns and turrets on it, and anti-aircraft guns that were originally to be designed to be used on a battleship. This tank also would have had around 10-inch thick armor all around its hull, and like you can imagine, this tank 5 times heavier than the heaviest tank the Germans had, seemingly completely indestructible, slowly moving towards its destination, destroying everything in its path. But the project was cancelled in 1943, mostly due likely to the feasibility of it all, or rather the lack of feasibility. There was never a prototype made, and we're not sure if there was even a detailed schematics made. It seemed to just be stuck at the, what if we had a 1,000-pound tank? And it seemed to kind of stall at that exact stage. There was also a Land Cruiser P-1500 monster tank proposed, which this one would have been around 7 times heavier than their largest tank ever made, but that one made even less progress towards being made. It was just like a flicker, a glint in Hitler's eye, with one of the German generals, Heinz Guderian, saying of Hitler that his fantasies sometimes shifted into the gigantic, which, I mean, why not? I always say, if you're gonna dream, dream big. I mean, I never say that, but it's a good saying regardless. The Ramree Island crocodiles was an event that may or may not have happened, at least to the degree that has been rumored, and that was in 1945 when the British Army was advancing against Japanese troops, and this was on the island of Ramree in Burma. The Japanese troops, around 1,000 of them, retreated into around 10 miles of swamps, and while traversing through the swamps, it was said that the crocodiles who lived in the swamps ended up killing and eating almost all of the 1,000 soldiers, with just a few of them making it out alive. Now, as I said, almost all of this is true. The location, the British advance, the Japanese retreat through crocodile-infested swamps, but it's often been disputed just how many of these Japanese soldiers died from crocodile attacks. Some later accounts and opinions said that a lot of them probably died from exhaustion, dehydration, infections, etc., with a few of them probably being killed by crocs, but nowhere near the full 1,000. So let me know your thoughts on this one down below. Whether you believe it, whether you think it was mostly crocs, partially crocs. I would love to hear your thoughts and maybe theories on this one. The Great Papago Escape was the largest prisoners of war escape to take place in an American camp in World War II. And during this escape, 25 Germans that were captured as prisoners of war, they escaped from this camp in Arizona. And the escape honestly is super interesting. It reads like, you know, a long lost season of early Prison Break or something. Like, the amount of similarities between the two is kind of insane. I think the writers of Prison Break genuinely saw this escape and were like, yeah, let's just do that, but with like Americans. And so the ringleader of this escape was the highest ranking officer in the camp, Captain Jürgen Wottenberg, who was deemed by a lot of Americans to be a super Nazi because, well, you know, he was a Nazi and he was also smart as hell and he seemed to cause trouble everywhere he went. And so for this reason, he was often moved from camp to camp because nobody really wanted to keep him. And at this particular camp, most of all of the men were U-boat sailors, which made sense. The battleground really wasn't anywhere near America. It was all in Europe, more or less. And so who would the Americans capture near America? Pretty much just submarine soldiers, or whatever they're called, sailors, submarine Nazi sailors. But Captain Wottenberg was a very smart man. He wanted to escape, and so he found an area of the camp that was completely hidden from the watchtower. And the blind spot was this little area next to the bathhouse where the men basically showered. And when they went to shower, the men would, instead of showering, they would just start digging. They removed a part of the wooden wall in the bathhouse, and after a while, they soon had a tunnel entrance leading into a basic tunnel, and they hid this entrance by placing a large coal container in front of it. So unless you came up and moved this container, you couldn't really see the tunnel entrance. They acquired shovels and rakes by basically requesting them to be used in their gardening, as there were also gardens on camp. And so they had a hole in the wall like Prison Break. They had a tunnel like Prison Break. They had a group of men using tools for their work duty, but actually using them to tunnel out, also like in Prison Break. The men would often dig at night and also during the day, and they would carry dirt out from the tunnel and dispose of it by flushing it down toilets, by hiding it behind walls, by carrying it out in their trousers, and then just dropping it down their pants legs out onto the fields of the camp. And as well as arranging their escape, Wottenberg also managed to secure, somehow, like, the man was an absolute genius, he secured new clothing for all of the escapees, also fake documents for all of the men, and also some contact information for people down in Mexico that would help house them, and if they made it that far, would help them get back to Germany. And this was all arranged from the comfort of this prison camp. And by the time they had finished, this tunnel was around 6 feet down into the ground. It was 175 feet or 54 meters long, and it went tunneling along and then obviously popped out into freedom. And Wottenberg also wanted to be gone for as long a time as possible before the Americans knew that he and his men were missing. So they arranged two very clever scenarios to basically prepare for this. They firstly started a strike with a bunch of the U-boat captains, saying that they would refuse to come for roll call unless it was conducted by an officer. Roll call being, of course, the Americans reading out the names of all of the Germans, and the Germans having to be present and to confirm, like, yep, I'm here, I'm all good, I haven't escaped down a tunnel or anything like that. And the Americans basically didn't allow this. The Germans continued to strike, and they came to some agreement eventually after 2 weeks where all the men would come to the roll call every single time, every day, except there was to be no roll call on Sunday at 9 a.m. And so they permanently removed that specific roll call in order to give the men a break on Sunday morning. And this was the agreement that they came to. Except Wottenberg had actually planned this strike himself. And now that he had what he wanted, which was a little gap where there would be no roll call Sunday mornings, he arranged another incident with some of the other prisoners, and that was for them, some of the ones who weren't escaping, to basically have these loud celebrations on Saturday night. And these loud celebrations acted as a distraction and made doubly sure that the guards' attention wasn't on the men escaping through the tunnel. So the escape began at 9 p.m. Saturday night, and by 2:30 a.m. all 25 men were out through the tunnel, and the guards were none the wiser. Most of the men split up after a while, going off in pairs, off in, different directions. Most of them headed south, hoping to make their way towards Mexico, which was their escape plan. And soon enough, the men were discovered missing. There were US soldiers, FBI agents, and scouts all out and about searching for these 25 men. And one by one, each of the escapees were caught. A lot of them were hungry, freezing, and lost. And a few of them were even caught just 10 miles shy of the Mexican border, just a few hours walk away from their eventual freedom. And the last men to evade capture was actually Captain Wattenberg and the 2 men that he was with, because they, instead of running as far away from the camp as possible, they, again, just like in Prison Break, stayed quite nearby, hoping that the authorities would basically go on ahead chasing the other men, leaving this immediate area a little more safe. And so his plan was wait till it was more quiet and then just walk away into freedom, completely unseen. And so while they were staying nearby, they hid in these caves north of the camp, not south of it. And this next part is honestly just absurd. But every few days, a man named Johann Kramer, who was one of the escaped men staying in the cave with Wattenberger, or Wattenberg, but Kramer would sneak back into the camp every few days. He would wait till one of the other prisoners was let out of the grounds for various reasons, doing some yard work, running errands, which, believe it or not, some of the prisoners were let out of the camp for reasons like this. But he would wait till this happened and he would switch with this man who was let out, this other prisoner. And then he would act as the prisoner. He would go back into the camp, gather information, gather food, and then be sent out again, for example, to run errands, and then go out and switch with this other prisoner who was now in the cave, and the two would just kind of switch back and forth every few days, which is just absolutely crazy. And they did this for an entire month before he was caught, and by that point Wattenberg had already left. He was heading down south around the local town. He slept in a hotel lobby, he traveled at night, and then one time he asked a cleaning crew for directions. They thought his accent was a little bit suspicious. They called the police, and finally Wattenberg, the last man standing, was also arrested. And the Germans were terrified when they were caught that, well, maybe not terrified because, they were brave soldiers, but they genuinely thought that they would be executed for doing this prison break, as they knew of a German camp back in Germany where 50 Allied prisoners of war had escaped and were executed for their escape attempt. But the Americans, I guess, were a little more kind. They, as punishment, just basically limited the Germans' rations to plain food and water and slightly smaller portions for just a month, which was around how long the men had been missing for. And that was more or less it. None of the guards or the camp command was punished for this, although the FBI did look into the security and blind spots of the camp and also of other camps in Arizona. The foil of destiny isn't what it was actually called, but I thought that just sounded so much better. But this was a technique used by the Royal Air Force, where pilots would drop vast amounts of aluminium or aluminum, depending on how you pronounce it, but these little aluminium strips, they would drop them from their planes, but in doing this, they would basically bombard and bamboozle the German radars. And if you can imagine, if you're a radar, you're kind of blinking up looking for metal things being planes, and then they would pick up signals, these thousands of points of data all over the place, and they wouldn't be able to pinpoint where the Allied planes were. And this method was used from 1943 with actually fairly decent success. And all it took was a few strips of shiny little foil. Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's most dangerous man. So for those who haven't heard of this guy, he was an absolute menace. He started off as a fairly early supporter of the Nazis in Austria, and then when the Nazis took over and annexed Austria, he officially joined the ranks as a member of the SS. And he had these scars on his face from fencing, and this wasn't the normal fencing you might expect in the modern day, you know, with padded everything, with face guards, with armor. No, this was like an old school form of fencing, in which the goal was, the aim was to be the first person to slice the opponent's face with a knife. And all they had as protection was this weird mask, which was just to protect their most vital features, their eyes and their nose. But this was seen as a bit of a crazy thing to do, but somewhat a manly thing to do. You know, it's kind of like seeing someone with cauliflower ears in today's day and age. Or this was maybe a little more extreme than that. But this would give these deep kind of face scars, these wounds, these cuts, and it was a way of showing people like, yes, I'm incredibly brave, I don't care about pain, and so if you saw someone with these face wounds, you had better watch out. But Otto was, you know, a bit of a psycho, and he regularly did this in his early days, and so had many visible scars just like this one. So Skorzeny quickly moved up through the ranks, and he was soon put in charge of supervising the kidnapping of Miklos Horthy Jr., who was the son of Hungary's regent. And this was basically to force the regent's surrender and to keep Hungary in the war on the side of Germany, as at the time the regent and some of the people in control were looking to basically defect and to negotiate with the Allies and possibly to turn on Germany at this point in the war. So that was a success, and he was quickly involved in quite a few more battles and attacks, and was well known for being quite a sneaky guy, of having these very clever, these very unusual battle plans, these tactical ideas. And so after he was struck in the head by shrapnel and forced off the front lines, he spent a while in Berlin coming up with and advising on unconditional commando warfare, of which he was very good. He was also involved in a major part in the mission to rescue Mussolini, which Mussolini, the Italian dictator, had at this point been basically overthrown in Italy and captured and imprisoned by the Italians, and he was being held in this prison in Italy. And the new leadership that had overthrown Mussolini, they were looking to basically end the war and to negotiate also with the Allies. And so Germany couldn't have this, Hitler couldn't allow this. They flew in there on this commando secret mission. They broke Mussolini out of prison. They flew him back to Germany, and this made Skorzeny like a minor celebrity in Germany, and also made him basically Hitler's new favorite commando. He was then involved in an insane operation, Operation Long Jump, which we will cover in full just a little bit further down in the iceberg. But he was also involved in, and this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, he was involved in many more. But one of the other major ones that he was involved in was something called Operation Grief, or Operation Grafe, in which Hitler instructed Skorzeny to lead a covert attack on the Allies and to gather a bunch of English-speaking troops to basically drive captured American tanks, wear American uniforms, and to infiltrate the American lines and obviously cause mass confusion, mass mayhem, and mass death. And Skorzeny and his men were well aware that this was absolutely against the rules of war, and that you couldn't wear an enemy soldier's uniform and just drive in their vehicles and basically masquerade as the enemy. And so any of the men who were captured wouldn't be taken as prisoners, but they would instead be executed. And they all knowingly took this risk before they went on the mission. And in total, 23 of his men were captured and 16 were executed for breaking the rules of war. And this mission, this entire offensive, with Skorzeny acting basically as major general of this operation, in which he oversaw around 5,000 men, was actually in the end quite decently successful. Hitler awarded him with the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, which is one of Germany's highest military honors, and then the war ended. And that's not even the most interesting part of his story, because he was a very smart man, very tactical, very knowledgeable, both on the field and off the field, on military and on political structures, on commando-style missions, on covert operations. And so, after the war, he was obviously captured, he was tried as a war criminal, with his main charges really being the imitation of American soldiers in that one mission. And in the end, eventually, these charges were actually dropped from Skorzeny, because he said, look, I told my men that they could wear the uniforms and they could use them to sneak through enemy lines, but that they shouldn't engage in combat or fight back while wearing the uniforms. And so he argued that this was a standard form of deception allowed as part of war, just like sending misleading signals to the enemies, or setting up fake attacks or fake radio broadcasts, etc. And since there was no evidence that Skorzeny had actually instructed his men to fight in these American uniforms, it was deemed technically that he didn't commit a war rules violation, because the major problem was fighting in the enemy uniforms, not necessarily just wearing them. And also it was found that the Allied troops had also highly considered using this same tactic. And so the tribunal, I think, was like, okay, how about, like even Stevens, no one's guilty of any of this, and just end of. And then after this, his post-war adventures begin. He was in an internment camp in Germany when he escaped from the camp by having 3 former SS officers dress up as American military police and come into the camp and take Skorzeny away because they said they needed to take him to Nuremberg for a legal hearing. And they just let them in, he was escorted out of the camp, and that was his escape. And he later said that he actually had help from the Americans themselves, and they were the ones who provided the uniforms to Skorzeny for his escape, and they also stood by and watched him leave, knowing full well what it was. So that part is very strange. He then hid for a year and a half in a barn in Bavaria in Germany before moving to France, where his photo was taken while at a cafe on the Champs-Élysées or Élysée in Paris, and then he had to move again. He got a fake passport, he moved to Madrid, and then from here on out he was involved in just many teaching exercises, covert operations for multiple countries, and basically anyone who wanted his expertise. He acted as Egypt's military advisor under the indirect direction of the CIA, and while doing this, he basically gathered a squad of former SS and Wehrmacht officers to basically train the Egyptian army. He also trained some Arab volunteers in like commando and subversion tactics, and this was all to be used against the British near the Suez Canal. Then he also trained a bunch of Palestinian refugees in commando stuff, helping them plan attacks on Israel, one of whom was actually the infamous Yasser Arafat. Then he served as general advisor to the Egyptian president, as well as advisor to the Argentinian president, and also as bodyguard to the president's wife. And perhaps the most surprising of all of these, Mossad themselves hired Skorzeny. Yes, the Israeli Jewish intelligence, they hired Skorzeny, a former hardcore SS officer, to work against Egypt and to gather information on any German rocket engineers that the Egyptians were using to fire rockets at Israel. And Skorzeny didn't really care at this point. Like, not that he ever really cared, but by this point, he was just a man for hire, like, yep, whoever pays me, I'll just do the work. And so Mossad must have come to him and said, like, we will pay you, and we will also take you off the Mossad Nazi assassination list. So if you help us, then we won't secretly kill you 20 years down the line. And so Skorzeny agreed to help them and gathered intelligence on some of the Arab countries and armies and movements, etc. all around the area. He also allegedly delivered some letter bombs for Mossad, killing 5 Egyptians at an Egyptian rocket site, also assassinating a German rocket scientist who was working for the Egyptians, and also gathering intelligence on and supplying the full names and addresses of all various German scientists and companies working with and for the Egyptian government. And apparently, the original plan by Mossad was just to kill Skorzeny. They found him, they turned up at his home, ready to, but ultimately they decided he was better off alive, and they were better off using and taking advantage of his incredible expertise. He later spent a little bit of time in Ireland, which the Irish found a little bit weird, a little bit suspicious, and he was responsible a bit earlier for setting up a secret organization named Die Spin, or I think it's Die Spin, which is the spider in German, which helped as many as 600 former SS men escape from Europe to mainly Argentina and then to disappear. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, but in my previous Iceberg, I mentioned a secret operation called Werewolf, which was the plan to, in its last days, as Germany was, being surrounded and the Allies were slowly moving in with the Soviets. This plan, the Werewolf plan, was to basically infiltrate the front lines, get behind the advancing enemy movement or enemy army, and to slowly start, picking the Allies off from behind, causing mayhem and chaos and panic. And in theory, this would stop the advance of the two armies because they would have to, in some way, turn back slightly and deal with all of these Germans behind their lines. But that operation, that mission that we covered in the previous Iceberg, that was actually overseen by Skorzeny himself. So he was a very skilled, a very well-informed, intelligent man, absolutely effective, absolutely terrifying, and, so effective that even Mossad was willing to put his history aside, with him being an SS officer, and to work with him, to learn from him, and to use him to their advantage. As obviously was the CIA, as was Egypt, as were the Arabs and the Palestinians. It seemed like just everybody wanted him. So yeah, a very unique individual, and ultimately one of the most significant figures and men in World War II. Willy Herold was kind of an interesting figure. He was born in a small village in Saxony, Germany in 1925, and when he was just 10 years old, he joined the Deutsches Jungvolk, or Deutsches, but this was a division of the Hitler Youth, but for boys between the ages of 10 and 14. So it was like the Hitler Extra Youth. And while a member of the Deutsches Jungvolk, he was a bit rambunctious, and he was actually expelled the next year at the age of 11 for skipping service and for trying to organize his own pack of boys, a group aside from the authority of the Hitler Youth, which is kind of crazy. So he was expelled, then he later joined the regular Hitler Youth at the age of 14, and then he started an apprenticeship as a chimney sweep. And then he ran away from that because he said he didn't feel like working anymore. Then he got brought back in, he finished his apprenticeship, and then when he turned 18, he joined the German military. And he served in the army for 2 years or so. He fought in a few battles, but that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is when the Nazis were being pushed out of the Netherlands in 1945, and Herold's unit, who was also retreating, in the chaos basically got separated, and Herold was then separated from his unit. And while walking alone back towards his lines, he found a shot-up, abandoned Wehrmacht truck lying on the side of the road. And inside the truck, he found the uniform of a highly decorated Luftwaffe captain. And so, as you do, Willy took this uniform, and he assumed the identity of Captain Herold of the 6th Parachute Division. Then he went to a control point. He convinced a major there to give him 4 soldiers who he now commanded. And so he finally got his own group of boys that he'd been wanting since the age of 10. So he went with these men, steadily growing more and more, more men along the way kind of joined along, with him having as many as 50 to 60 men join and leave him at various points. He also claimed to be on a special mission directly from Hitler, which, that's totally believable. And he basically went around doing little recon missions, fighting with the enemy. He lost a bunch of men here and there. He recruited some more here and there. And then he basically started to get annoyed that he didn't have enough men or enough equipment to really make an impact on the enemy. And just by chance, he seemingly solved his problem when he learnt about a local penal camp where there were hundreds of former Wehrmacht soldiers waiting for the war to end. Just hundreds of men without a leader. So he rocked up to the camp. He was asked to judge some of the men, some of the inmates, and was like, yeah, they're absolutely guilty. And then he just ordered 5 of them shot dead. And he would have killed even more, but he was stopped by the judicial official, a man named Friedrich Hansen, who basically said, look, you can't just come in here and execute them, without permission, of course. So he sent him over to a man named Dr. Richard Thiel to get permission. And from there, Harold then visited the district leader, who they then got the Gestapo involved. And after all of this, Harold was given permission to execute 30 of the men in the camp. And over the next 2 weeks, Harold ordered many, many more executions. And as well as these executions, he basically recruited a bunch of these men, a bunch of these inmates to serve as his personal workforce, having them equip themselves with uniforms and guns and sending them out to the local town of Leer. And this didn't last long, however, as most of the men just surrendered to the Poles at the first opportunity they got. But after the camp was bombed and destroyed, Harold recruited more prisoners, and he and these men traveled north, basically terrorizing town after town. They went into another nearby prison. They executed 5 Dutch prisoners there, first making them dig their own graves, which is just kind of cruel. They hanged a farmer who surrendered to them, and they were just all-round awful people. And eventually they were caught, they were taken into custody, and Harold then escaped. He made his way over to Wilhelmshaven. He assumed his real identity of Willie Harold, and he got all of his war documents, his identity documents in order, and resumed his work as a chimney sweep. So he must have thought he was pretty slick. He had committed all of these war crimes and nobody was any the wiser because he had done them under the name of a false identity that didn't exist. But just a few weeks later, Willie was basically found out. He was arrested for stealing a loaf of bread, and they brought him in, they interviewed him, they, managed to come to the conclusion that he had been lying, that he was actually this decorated captain that had gone round doing all these war crimes. And the British forced Willie and his men who followed him to dig up all of the bodies themselves of all of the inmates they killed at this camp. And the men did do this, and after all was said and done, 195 bodies were dug up. Willie and 6 other men were sentenced to death for their war crimes, with Willie being responsible, it was said, for the murders of 111 people. So yeah, a pretty crazy man. He seemed like even from a young age, he really wanted power, he wanted control, he wanted respect and authority, but also didn't really want to work for it. And so yeah, I think in the end, he quite deservedly got what he deserved, but it's just a shame that all of those people had to die first. The Blackout Ripper was like Jack the Ripper, but blackout. And he was a guy who joined the Royal Air Force in 1935 and was sent out to the front lines in 1942. But during those 7 years, or actually during the 2 years between 1941 and 1942, he is thought to have killed multiple women in London, and even though he was stationed at the time near Bristol, he was known to make his way down to London when on break. His first victim was a 19-year-old clerk, Maple Churchwood, who was killed on the 12th of October 1941 and was found naked and strangled to death in a destroyed house the very next day. Then 5 days later, 48-year-old Edith Humphreys was found in her home just 1 mile away from Maple's body, with her as well having been massively bludgeoned about the head and the face, and also strangled, and also with her throat having been slit. She also had a stab wound through her skull that actually made its way into her brain, and she was found alive after all of this, which is just absolutely insane. She was brought very quickly to the hospital, but sadly died shortly after arriving. Then, a few months later, Evelyn Hamilton, who was a pharmacist, was found dead in an air raid shelter in London. Then, a few days later, Evelyn Oatley was found dead on her bed in Soho in London. Then, still a few days later, Margaret Lowe was found dead in her flat in London. And then, another few days later, which, like, Jesus Christ, this guy moves quick. But just a few days after this, Catherine Mulcahy was found, and she was actually found alive once again in London. And this was one of the ones who got away, because Gordon had actually gone with Mulcahy back to her flat, and the two had prepared to engage in adult activities, shall we say. And once the two arrived in her flat, she had stripped down, she had gone to her bed, and then he had stripped down, climbed on top of her, and importantly, Mulcahy had removed all of her clothes except her shoes. And the shoes she was wearing were somewhat bulky boots. So Gordon climbed on top of her, and then suddenly he kneed her in the chest, and she was completely winded from this. And while she was stunned, he started to hold her down and to strangle her. And she naturally fought back. She scratched him. She tried to attack his face, but he was holding her down. And then she just Ka-cha! Kicked him with her boots, which sent him falling off the bed. And this allowed Mulcahy the chance to jump out of bed, run out of her flat and into her neighbor's flat, still completely naked. Now, Gordon could just have run away at this point, but he basically wanted to maybe save his own skin. He wanted to smooth things over, hopefully with Mulcahy, so that she didn't go to the police. So he quite calmly and psychotically, he got dressed, he knocked on the neighbor's door and offered to pay her some more money. He said, he was sorry, he was just drunk, he was going through some stuff, he shouldn't have been so aggressive with her. Maybe he was a teeny tiny bit rough, he got carried away, but he didn't really mean any damage or harm by it. And he said, look, I'll just pay you 3 times as much as I was originally going to pay you, and then I'll just leave and, let bygones be bygones. But she was not convinced. She kept screaming murderer at him, and then Gordon just eventually left. But in his panic, he had left his Royal Air Force webbing belt in Mulcahy's flat. And when I said that he moved fast earlier, I really meant it, because that very same night, he encountered Doris Jornet, and he went back to her flat with her, and she was found the next day dead on her bed. And then finally, the next evening, so this is 2 nights in a row with 3 attacks, he approached a woman named Margaret Haywood. And the two were kind of flirting together. I guess she found him a bit attractive. So they spent kind of a bit of time together in the evening in the bar. And then he started to get all handsy with her. And as they were walking down the street, he kind of touched her, she pushed him away, and then he attacked her, choking her unconscious. And just at that moment, a 18-year-old delivery boy kind of saw this whole scene. He said yo, what the hell is going on here? Gordon immediately fled. Haywood then woke up, and the 18-year-old boy and Haywood then went to the police to report this attack. And once again, in this mayhem, Gordon had left behind his gas mask and his haversack at the site of the attack, and along with these items was printed his service number, his Royal Air Force service number that tied back to his identity and his name. And I didn't really mention these details as we were going through each murder, because I just wanted to get through them all, but some of them are honestly just too gruesome to even mention. But I will talk about some of the ones that were kind of borderline. But most all of these women that he killed were attacked incredibly brutally, beaten repeatedly. Many of them had slash and stab wounds all over their bodies. They had things inserted into their you-know-what. Also, often their you-know-whats were mutilated, cut, stabbed. They were mutilated with, can openers, razor blades. They had knives sticking out of their bodies when they were found. Some of them had their abdomens cut open with literally organs hanging out. it was just completely sick stuff. But Gordon by this point had returned to his RAF base and his belongings were found at the scene. So, the police traced them back using his RAF number. They traced all of this back to Gordon and they contacted his base and he was soon arrested. And he, all the while, was saying he was completely innocent, that he had been framed for these murders. Someone else had taken his RAF belongings, gone out, done the murders, and then planted them at the scenes, knowing that they would trace back to Gordon. But they basically didn't believe any of this. There was really too much evidence against him, and he was found guilty of these murders in just 35 minutes by the jury. He was physically identified by two of the women who had escaped and survived. They also found traces of blood on his clothes and on his belt. His RAF number was obviously at the scene, as was his other RAF belt from another crime scene. Also, some other women, some other people who weren't involved in the killings or attacks themselves, but were perhaps people walking down the street or people in the bar when Gordon met these women. They also positively identified Gordon as the one who was with these women, and his fingerprints matched one found on the actual weapons. So as if that wasn't enough evidence against him, he also had multiple trophies or mementos from the women that he killed, some of which were on his person when he was found. So it was an absolutely open and shut case, and he was hanged just a few months later, with this actually being the only convicted murderer in British history to have been executed during an air raid, as there were, planes up above, bombs dropping, all as this hanging was taking place. The Nazi would air base. So these were these fake bases, constructed by the Germans in World War II, made entirely out of wood. And they had planes, trucks, tanks, hangars, all basically in an attempt to trick the Allied bombers. And as the legend goes, upon hearing of the locations of one of these wooden bases, a British pilot had a fake wooden bomb made, and he flew over this fake wooden base. He dropped his wooden bomb, and when it landed, it had a note on it that simply read, "Wood for wood." Now, whether or not that's actually true or not, I'm not entirely sure, but it does make for a pretty interesting and hilarious story. The Fugo balloon bomb was literally a balloon bomb made by the Japanese in World War II and used against the Americans. It was a hydrogen-filled paper balloon, and it was 33 feet or around 10 meters in diameter, that came with 4 5-kilo explosives and one 15-kilo explosive. And what they would do is they would send these balloons out from Japan. They would send them high up, they got caught in the air currents, and they would be carried all the way over to the United States. And the goal of the Japanese was to hopefully start some forest fires, to set some important things ablaze, or destroy, random little areas, just basically to cause a bit of damage, but also mass panic, mass mayhem. If there were 10 huge forest fires going off all at the same time across America, then the Americans would need to scale back on food production and weapons productions, and it was basically just an indirect attack on America. They sent out over 9,000 of these from Japan, and around 300 of them were later found in either the United States or in Canada or in Mexico. And it's a fantastic idea. They didn't really do that much damage, with no large-scale forest fires or damage or what have you being attributed to these bombs. Although 6 people were killed in Oregon when one of these bombs exploded nearby, making these the only actual US deaths in the contiguous US, which is like this main area here, by the enemy in World War II. The only ones. And this Fugu bomb, as wild as it looks and actually sounds, was also the first weapon with intercontinental range ever invented. With intercontinental being going from continent to continent like this. Like, not even the Germans had this capability at this time. Operation Pastorius was a widely, unheard of mission by the Germans, where they basically sent 8 German soldiers or sailors in a submarine over to the United States. And it was to 2 locations, to New York and to Florida. And the plan was to land them on shore and then for them to leave the submarine, to go onto land and to destroy some railroads, some power plants, some manufacturing plants, and to just basically disrupt the war effort. And it definitely wasn't really a success. It was probably a very good idea, but the 4 men who landed in Long Island very quickly discovered that they were spotted by a Coast Guard named John Cullen. And he was unarmed at the time, so he couldn't really do anything. But the Germans bribed him into keeping his silence, and the team then hid their explosives and went to New York City. But certain that he would eventually blow the whistle and that their cover had been blown, and it was only a matter of time before they were caught, 2 of the men, George Dash and Ernst Berger, decided to basically just contact the FBI, surrender, and hoped that it would buy them some leniency, some mercy, which it actually did. The other team landed successfully in Florida, but thanks to Dash and Berger informing the FBI, all 8 men were soon arrested, and all of them except Dash and Berger were executed, with them later being deported back to Germany just a few years later in 1948. Unit 731. So many of you may have already heard about this unit, in which case you may have been scarred for life, but it was, and I'm not even being facetious here, but it was perhaps the worst single unit and set of experiments ever carried out in the world ever. And it started in the 1920s and 30s, when the Geneva Protocol banned biological weapons in war. And the Japanese thought, hey, if they're banning biological weapons, that must mean that they are really effective. And so they started to basically research their own biological weapons. And by 1933, after Japan had taken over Manchuria, which was this area of China, they created Unit 731 and started on their dark experiments. They said basically that the Chinese people were less than nothing. They were basically animals to them, dogs, rats sort of thing. And so they had an almost endless supply of test subjects to experiment on, that being loads of people and civilians and citizens from villages all over Manchuria. And they did some absolutely messed up stuff to a lot of these civilians. And I can't possibly cover all of them here. I may do a full video on this in the future, but they did, for example, live amputations of limbs, so without any anesthetic while the people were still living, to forcibly injecting civilians with various diseases like the plague, cholera, trying to come up with other diseases of their own, and also trying to make them more deadly. They would do live dissections, again with no anesthetic, just cutting people open, observing their organs as they could. They would also do tests on pregnant women, which I honestly don't even want to get into, but you can imagine just the sickest stuff in that regard. They also did tests with extreme temperatures and extreme pressure, like for example putting test subjects out in the cold or putting them in a room with water submerged up to, their knees or ankles, and just leave them in there for days at a time. And then when they were almost dying of hypothermia, they would bring them into a really hot room and just see how it affected their organs. Maybe they would chop off a leg or two, see how the body parts reacted to the cold. Like, they straight up treated these people as if they were, mindless dummies or something. But no, they were humans with actual feelings and pain receptors and all of that. An estimated 13,000 people died at this facility, with a further 200,000 estimated to have been killed with biological weapons that were developed in this unit. And so yeah, one of the sickest entries that I maybe have ever covered. It's at least definitely up there, and I may very well consider doing a full video on this sometime in the future, as going into detail about it just absolutely blows your mind. Wolf's Lair. And this is just a quick one, but I thought it was just too cool not to at least briefly mention. But the Wolf's Lair, as it was called, or Wolfschanz, was Hitler's main military headquarters on the Eastern Front. It was located in Poland in the Masurian Woods, and it consisted of almost 200 buildings, a power station, a cinema, a railway station, 2 airports, and a lot of it was top secret and heavily guarded and monitored. And interestingly enough, this was also where the briefcase assassination of Hitler took place, or assassination attempt. This was while he was in a meeting at the Wolf's Lair. And it's quite interesting. A lot of the bases and headquarters that Hitler used were named after the wolf. You had this one, or the Wolf's Lair. You also had the Wolf's Schlucht 1 and 2. These were in Belgium and France. You had the werewolf in Ukraine, and the name Adolf actually comes from the Germanic Athelwolf, meaning noble wolf, and apparently a nickname among Adolf's closest friends for him was Wolf. Hitler spent years up here in the Wolf's Lair, especially towards the middle and the end of the war. And as I said, it was an absolutely huge place with over 2,000 people living and working there. The buildings in this forest, in these woods, were all camouflaged with like foliage and bushes and fake trees and grass, with also these vast nettings, over the top, with like camo and branches and all sorts, basically making it look from above like a regular forest. And I think it was just a really cool designed place. Like, it looks like some ancient Celtic buildings in a fairy infested woods or something. Fairy infested makes it sound like they're vermin. No, like a fairy habitated woods. And while Hitler was, super hyper paranoid, saying, that the Allies know where we are, they can see us clearly, they're planning this massive bombing of the compound, they'll kill everyone inside, there's no real evidence that the Allies, and especially the Soviet Union, even knew the location of this lair and the extent of its vastness. But in the end, the only people who really did much damage to the lair were in fact the Nazis themselves, because as the Red Army was approaching, they decided to flee back towards Germany to abandon the lair and to, as they were leaving, detonate upwards of 100 tons of TNT. So, completely destroying as much of the lair as they possibly could. It is currently open to visit as a tourist attraction, if you are ever in Poland. So I think a very cool piece of history and place to visit if you're ever there. Ian Fleming's real-life spy work before 007. So the guy who created 007, James Bond, all that super cool spy stuff, he, being Ian Fleming, he was actually a spy himself during World War II. And he was a British naval intelligence officer who served as a personal assistant to Rear Admiral John Godfrey, who he said later was an inspiration for his character of M. Fleming helped plan, for example, Operation Mincemeat, which we covered earlier. The homeless guy dressed up to look like a high-ranking officer with these secret plans planted on him and then pushed overboard into the sea for the Germans to find and discover these fake secret plans. Yeah, Ian Fleming basically came up with that idea. He also oversaw the 30 Assault Unit Commando Squad, which specialized in going behind enemy lines and covertly stealing enemy documents, code books, equipment, all sorts of stuff, and securing it for the Allies. He was also engaged in espionage work in Spain and Portugal, with him at one point meeting a double agent by the name of Dusko Popov, and said during this meeting he saw Popov betting quite heavily at the Baccarat table, just in order to upset one of his rivals. So, you can see likely where he got his inspiration for Casino Royale from. He was also part of the planning of Operation GoldenEye, which was basically a contingency plan that involved having plants and spies in Spain so that if Germany invaded Spain, the Allies, through their plants and their spies and their networks, would still be able to monitor the country and the situation and, of course, the Germans. And obviously, he later then used this same operation name for one of his films, that being GoldenEye. So yeah, a very cool guy, a very cool character. I think this makes the novels and the films even more fascinating, knowing that all of this likely came from experience. He wasn't just sitting around just making up spy nonsense. Well, I mean, of course, sometimes he was, but that's just showbiz, baby. But it is very cool to know that he was basically kind of 007 himself. And he had that mind, that ability to plan all of these operations and recon work, which he did do in real life during World War II. Very cool. Russian white emigres in Charlemagne Division. So if you'll remember, during the Russian Civil War, it was the communists on one side under Leon Trotsky, and the people opposing them on the other side, the White Army. So the communists, the Red Army, they end up winning. They end up taking over the country, forming the Soviet Union. But the White Army, who weren't communists, they were more like conservatives and monarchists and Tsarists, I guess. But a lot of them, after their defeat, fled to various countries in Europe. And a bunch of them were actually in France during the outbreak of World War II. And so when Germany went to fight Russia, to fight the Red Army, a bunch of these White Army veterans who were living in France decided to join the war and the fight against the Soviets. So they joined the 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne, and they actually helped the Germans fight against the Soviets and then later helped in the final defense of Berlin. 99 Luftballons. So this is an entry in regards to something called Operation Outward, in which the British would send out over 99,000 of these large balloons, just cheap regular balloons filled with hydrogen, and some of them containing explosives, just like the Japanese balloons we covered earlier. But other balloons also had this steel kind of cable steel wire hanging from them, and this steel wire would, hang down from the balloons. It would kind of drag on the floor a bit, with the idea being that they would send out all of these balloons all over Germany. Some of them would hopefully start forest fires or, explode in barns or farms. But the ones with the cables dragging behind them would hopefully get caught in power lines and disrupt a bunch of stuff that way. Or, get caught in all manner of things and just be an absolute thorn in the side for the Germans. They flew at only about half the height of the Japanese balloons and with far less distance than the Japanese balloons did, obviously because Germany was a lot closer to the UK than America was to the Japanese. And they likely, it is thought, did kind of a medium amount of damage to the Germans. It's not super easy to assess the exact numbers on this, but since the balloons themselves were so cheap, compared to rockets and grenades and guns and ammunition, these balloons were the equivalent of like pennies. Because of this, it is very likely that they cost the British less than they did damage to the Germans, if I even worded that correctly. But the idea for these came about from something called barrage balloons, which were used as far back as even World War I. And these were these huge, large balloons that would basically be tied down with steel cables and floated above certain targets, making it dangerous, or in some cases impossible, for enemy planes to, fly by, fly over them, or drop bombs on them. And one time in 1940, a bunch of them broke loose, and in a large scale, they all were dragged by the wind over to Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, where they were reported as doing a fair amount of damage, of damaging power lines, disrupting railways, knocking down antennae. And so a week later, they brought it up that, maybe we should look to use some balloons on the Germans, say 99,000 of them, and just like that, Operation Outward was born. Lady Be Good. So the Lady Be Good was the name of this aircraft, a brand new B-24D Liberator bomber, looking to bomb freedom into people that basically went missing without a single trace on its first mission in World War II. It flew out from Libya to Naples for a bombing mission, and then on its way back, it just completely disappeared. It was suspected to have been lost in the Mediterranean Sea and was only actually found in 1958, 15 years later, in the Libyan desert. And 8 of the bodies or remains were found over the years, but one of them never was. And what they suspected likely happened was that this crew, who was fairly new, they had flown past their base in Libya, maybe in a sandstorm so they couldn't really see, and they mustn't have realized this. So they flew past the base, they must have been looking around and were like, God, are we not there yet? Are we not back at the base yet? And so they kept flying and flying, souther and souther. And eventually they ran out of fuel. They had to jump from the plane. And then they all died in the desert trying to escape it. So a very tragic tale, a tragic fate for everyone on board. And I'm sure things like this must have happened just all the time in World War II, but this was just one of the many ones that we actively know about. Sergei Aleshkov is a absolutely true, absolutely wild tale of a young kid born to a peasant family in Russia in 1936. And he was born in this rough area, and when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Sergei was just 5 years old. And so when this invasion happened, his 2 older brothers went off to join the Red Army, and they did go off, they fought on the front lines, and it is unclear whether they made it out alive or not. His father had died at a young age, with their mother raising this family alone. And the village he was living in was a little bit out of the way. It was in a forest, and the Germans soon occupied this exact area of the Ulyanovsk district. And because some of the residents in the village were fighting back against the Germans decided to just burn down the entire village and kill everyone inside. So they captured Sergei's other older brother. So the oldest 2 went off to war. This was the other one. They captured him, they tortured him, and they hanged him from a tree. And Sergei's mother was shot to death while trying to rescue her son. So Sergei now had no family. And he was hiding when his mother was shot, and when he saw her being shot, he immediately ran out to try and save her, and instead one of the German soldiers kicked him in the head and knocked him unconscious. He was then saved by a local woman. He regained consciousness, and he was pushed out of a window by this same woman, but not as like an attack or, abuse or anything. She apparently pushed him out of this window, to freedom. She said, "You can't go out the front door, they'll see you. Go out this window, run as far and as fast as you possibly can." And he did, just before the entire village was burnt down and everyone inside massacred. Sergei then spent several days lost in this vast forest, not eating, not drinking, and when he was found by a Soviet recon team, he was very poorly, he was skinny, he had insect bites everywhere, and he was taken across the front lines to the infirmary in the headquarters of the Soviet military unit, where he slowly recovered. And by this point, he again was only 6 years old. But the assistant commander of the 510th Guards Rifle Regiment, a man named Mitrofan Vorobich, he felt very sorry for Sergei. No siblings, no parents, no home, no direction, nothing. And so Vorobich refused to let Sergei be taken away to an orphanage, and he said he felt a certain connection to the kid, and so he decided it would be best if he stay on the military base, where he could keep a constant close eye on him. And Vorobich soon officially actually adopted Sergei, and this allowed him to stay on the base. He was recruited technically into the Soviet army, making him the youngest soldier to serve in World War II at just 6 years old. And obviously he couldn't really serve on the front lines, so he just hung around the base, helping with menial tasks, helping organize and transport supplies, cheering up the soldiers on the base, handing out letters, and everyone on the base absolutely adored him, and they saw him as a true patriot fighting in his own way for the motherland. A little while later, this division got called to the front lines. Vorobich was stuck in a hole, and Sergei first tried to dig him out himself, but obviously he was just 6 years old, and so he then ran through artillery shelling to call for help, and through this all, he ended up saving the life of his adoptive father, actually earning Sergei the Medal for Military Merit. He also once asked to be promoted to lieutenant, which is kind of hilarious, like a 6-year-old lieutenant. And he was at various points injured on the field, with one time being shot in the foot by a German plane, and also nearly drowning while trying to cross a river in Ukraine, but he survived both of these. He went to fight in Poland with his regiment, where he was injured once more and then was sent ultimately back to Russia to recover. Soon enough, the war ended. He went to military school, and early on he did fairly decently in physical activities as he was very fit, but later on in life, due to a lifetime of smoking starting from a very young age, as you can imagine, his stamina started to suffer, and he died at the age of only 54 from a heart attack, with some of his last words being before he died that, and I quote, "At least I lived longer than Adolf Hitler." And so yeah, a wild story. He had an absolutely brutal childhood. Like, I just can't even imagine that. And honestly, it was a great thing that Vorobich did. You know, giving this young child, giving Sergei a father, a purpose, a family that he had really only just recently completely lost. The secret escape line run by Belgian teenagers. So this was something called the Comet Line, which was the largest escape network in occupied Europe during World War II. And in 3 years, this line helped almost 800 people escape to Spain and to get out of the dangerous occupied France and Belgium and into safer lands. It was run or helped by more than 3,000 civilians, and it was very cool, very sophisticated. You know, if you were a British soldier, for example, who was shot down, they had loads of these, you know, lookouts, loads of these scouts all over the country. And so if someone saw you, they would be able to take you somewhere, you know, into someone's house or an attic or a barn or something. They would be able to hide you, to feed you, to give you new clothes, to clean you up, to give you fake papers, and then ultimately escorted safely into Spain, and then from there, mostly back to Britain. Their motto was Pugna Queen Percutius, which is Latin for fight without arms, as this network, this resistance, never took armed resistance to the Germans, rather they just fought in other ways. Or, you know, if you can think of saving people as fighting, but they pushed back at least against the Germans and what they wanted to do without ever taking up arms against them. And working for this network wasn't without its risks. A few hundred of these workers, these volunteers on this line were arrested, tortured, killed, but the line itself never stopped working. And as I said, it saved over 800 individuals during the course of the war. Nieves Fernandez was an awesome guerrilla fighter, meaning that she fought in, you know, covert underhand ways, not that she was fighting large apes, but this was in the Philippines during World War II. And the Philippines at the time was held by the United States, and then the Japanese took over, and it was at that time that Fernandez, who was a local school teacher, organized a resistance militia of over 100 fighters. And she was around like mid to late 30s at this time. The Japanese invaded, and she, sometimes known as Miss Fernandez, which was a nod to her history as a teacher. She was also known as Captain Fernandez or the Silent Killer, but she organized constant warfare against the Japanese using improvised explosives or large traditional knives, single-shot pipe shotguns, just absolutely all sorts, as well as just general bamboozlement, you know, as you would expect in most guerrilla warfare. And to begin with, this group, this militia, they only had 3 US rifles. And so a lot of their attacks and weapons were in the form of these more makeshift tools. And she was, honestly, extremely effective. Over time, they got more and more US equipment and weapons, they looted some Japanese ammo and weapons, and became slowly more and more well equipped, with her guerrilla force eventually joining up with the larger Black Army of the Philippines, led by a man named Ruperto Canglion. But she was strict, she was fierce, she killed around 200 Japanese soldiers, and for this, the Japanese had placed a bounty on her head of roughly $100,000 in today's money. But the bounty was never claimed, and after the war, she just went back to living a quiet life in her hometown with her family. She lived off into her 90s before dying in 1997. So yeah, just an absolutely insane lady that just in that one small period during the war, you know, she went from school teacher to just crazy, ruthless guerrilla fighter, killing hundreds of Japanese soldiers, a lot of the time with just a giant knife. And then, after the war, just back to peaceful grandma living into her 90s in a quiet village. The twin experiment was absolutely brutal, and it was conducted by the angel of death, Joseph Mengele. And if you recognize the name Joseph Mengele, you will know that this was some really messed up stuff. Part of the purpose was to study twins, to study hereditary traits, and to see if there was a twin gene, something that they could maybe clone or promote somehow in order to increase the odds of twins being produced. Because if you can imagine, if they just had twins instead of kids, then they would really be having twice as many kids. And so that was part of the idea. If you could find a twin gene, then you could, in theory, as a nation, have twice as many kids, twice as many children as your opponents. And this would obviously be incredibly effective when it comes to war. So they got a bunch of twins, they imprisoned a bunch of them, and they measured all parts of their body. They injected various dyes, for example, into their eyes, trying to change their eye color. They did various blood transfusions between the twins. They did amputations to see if certain limbs or body parts would work on the other twin. So, cut off both of their right arms and then swap them and try and stitch them back on. And they also removed their organs and transplanted them into the other twin. Like, it was some really messed up, twisted stuff. Most of the twins ended up dying, unsurprisingly. Or if they did survive, then Mengele killed them anyway to study their corpses. For science. And of the over 1,000 sets of twins, only a few hundred survived, many of them being badly scarred, either mentally, physically, or both. Camp Siegfried was a summer camp in the 1930s with the aim to promote Nazism to kids. And the surprising part is, this wasn't even located in Germany. It was located in Yaphank, Long Island in obviously the United States, and the Nazis wouldn't come into power in Germany for another 3 years, and they wouldn't even declare war on anyone or invade another country until 1938 and 9. And so in 1930, this Nazi camp was like, oh yeah, that's an ideology. It's a bit interesting, it's a bit out there in a way, but for the people of the time, it wasn't illegal. Most people didn't even really know what or who Nazis were, because as you can imagine, America wasn't at war with Germany. Germany wasn't even at war with anyone. The Nazis weren't in power, and so this was at the time just like a niche ideology. They also had a Camp Hindenburg in Wisconsin, a Camp Nordland in New Jersey, the Deutschhorst Country Club in Pennsylvania, and another camp in Windham, New York. And they were all owned by the German-American Bund, which I don't know what a Bund is, but this was basically a German pro-Nazi organization that looked to spread Nazism in America to gain legitimate public support for it, and in a perfect world for the Nazis, to maybe spread this ideology over in America, to win the United States over and have them as allies in any potential hypothetical upcoming world wars. Jean-Marie Laurette was Hitler's only son, or at least he claims that he was. Because by official records, Hitler was unmarried most of his life, he had no children, but this man, Jean-Marie Laurette, claims that he never knew his father and that his mother just always told him that his father was an unknown German soldier that she had had relations with during World War I. But in 1948, she revealed, apparently, to Jean-Marie that this unknown soldier was actually Adolf Hitler. And eyewitnesses had attested that during World War I, Hitler did have a relationship with Charlotte, who was Jean-Marie's mother, and that Hitler had stayed in the areas where Charlotte lived. And also, according to Jean-Marie, his mother said that when your father was around, he had a temper. He would often scream and rant in German to just imaginary audiences, because she only spoke French and he only spoke German, and it would slightly make sense that she wouldn't want to reveal this to her son, if this was true, because if this ever got out while Hitler was alive, you might have a Game of Thrones type of thing going on with, all the illegitimate children of Hitler being snuffed out. But that is all if you believe Jean-Marie's account of it and of what his mother said. Because we don't really have his mother's testimony, we have his testimony about what his mother said. And Jean-Marie died of a heart attack in 1985, but they did later do DNA analysis of known relatives of Hitler and of Laurette's relatives and found there to be no common ancestor. So while it doesn't technically absolutely disprove this, I would like to know what you guys think about this one down in the comments below. Project Habakkuk was a very unique project, and it was to build a large, some say ship, some say island, out in the middle of the Atlantic to be used by military ships to land, to refuel, and to take off from, much the same way that we use aircraft carriers in today's military. And it was a pretty ambitious project. The largest warship or aircraft carrier ever built is the USS Gerald R. Ford. This absolute beast, which can hold around 75 modern airplanes and has around 4,500 personnel on board. And lengthwise, it is around 1,100 feet. But this Project Habakkuk, this proposed aircraft carrier, was to be around 600 meters or almost 2,000 feet. So roughly twice the length of the longest aircraft carrier ever made. And this was back, 80 years ago. And how would they have achieved this gargantuan size in the 1940s? Well, they wouldn't make it out of steel, at least not entirely, because steel was quite still expensive during the war, and it was in short supply. They were using it to make tanks and weapons and bombs. And so while they would have used steel in this aircraft carrier, it wouldn't be completely steel. It would instead be made out of something called pykrete, which was basically ice fortified with wood pulp. Yeah, and the idea that they originally had was to take an iceberg, just a absolutely massive one, and level off the top of it, lay down floor mats, that sort of thing, lay down a bit of grip so they didn't slide all over the place, and use that to land planes on in the Atlantic. They were also planning on hollowing out some of the iceberg so that they could, put planes down inside of it for storage, which is already just an insane project to consider, but they decided that that would be too unpredictable. The ice would melt too quickly, and icebergs tended to have a somewhat high chance of flipping over, especially if they were interacted with too much. And so this instead was proposed, to produce basically the iceberg themselves, but also add a bunch of wood pulp to the ice, which served actually a few really decent purposes. So this iceberg they produced themselves would be produced at really a fraction of a cost of a full steel aircraft carrier, and by infusing wood pulp or sawdust into the ice, it would, one, make it much tougher, and it would also make it melt a lot slower. And this, combined with the proposed refrigeration units on board this, pykrete berg, this would have made it last, in theory, a good few years, and it would be stronger than a regular ship, with bullets in the tests regularly flying off this, ice wood concoction. And the name Habakkuk actually comes from the Bible, from verse Habakkuk 1:15, which is, "Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told you." And so this was supposed to be the unbelievable thing, which if you told people about it, like I am doing now, they wouldn't even believe it. But in the end, this project was abandoned for various reasons, mainly because it was just deemed, just too difficult to pull off reliably and too expensive, and so the legend of the Habakkuk iceberg aircraft carrier was never made a reality. Operation Vegetarian was a plan in World War II by the British to airdrop anthrax-infected linseed cakes, which are these delicious little things. Yum. And they were designed for cattle across Germany to eat and then to catch anthrax, and then in turn kill or cripple the human population of Germany when they ate this meat. And over 5 million of these anthrax cakes were produced, but for whatever reason they were never sent out and were shortly after incinerated and destroyed. And from what I can tell, they likely didn't send these out because 1, it looked by this point like the Allies were gonna win the war anyway. You know, they would soon have France entirely recaptured, and so I guess this was deemed just too unnecessary. And 2, there's some evidence to suggest that the Allies were scared that if they started using biological warfare, that the Germans would do the same, and then it would just be absolute hell for everyone once it escalated. So they were mostly just keeping these back as like a retaliatory measure, you know, in case the Germans ever struck first with biological stuff. But either way, absolutely crazy operation. And I also love the way that Operation Vegetarian was named, you know, because you would need to become a vegetarian after the attack because you couldn't eat the cows. So, you know, fantastic sense of humor by the British. But anyway, the next entry is the V3 Supergun. So if you'll remember earlier on in the video, we covered the V1 and the V2 German weapons. The V1, you know, the screaming bombs that flew on their own. They looked like miniature planes, very effective, very cost efficient. And the V2, which were the crazy rockets that flew up into space and were actually the first man-made objects in space and the first man-made objects that broke the sound barrier. So all very cool stuff. But when talking about the super weapons, we need to go back just briefly to World War I. And the Germans were fighting the French, obviously, and they had developed something called the Paris gun, which was this absolutely huge long-range siege gun built by the Germans that could bombard Paris with shells from over 75 miles away. So an incredibly long range for the time. And for the people in Paris, for the people in France, this must have been absolutely terrifying. And in fact, because the shells from this Paris gun went so high into the air, around 26 miles into the atmosphere, the calculations that the Germans had to do for, you know, targeting, for aiming, had to actually take into account the rotation of the Earth. So once again, I've said this many times, the Germans were insane with their engineering. But this gun was made and it was used against the French, and so the French started to come up with their own countermeasure, which was a super long-range multi-chambered gun, but they never made it past the planning stage. So soon World War I comes to an end, everything is settled, but come World War II, Germany invades France, and they find these plans from World War I for a long-range multi-chambered gun. And they think, wait a minute, we could make a religion out of that. But they thought we can probably build that, but like a better version of that. And with that range, we can probably directly attack London. And that is exactly what they did. And part of the problem with long-range weapons was that in order to launch a shell or a missile or a bomb that far, you needed an absolute ton of energy. And you can't just keep feeding these missiles more and more energy, because you essentially have, you know, the arm of the rocket launcher. And if you have the missile down here looking to, you know, shoot it upwards, you essentially need to detonate a small bomb at the base of it. You know, in guns, you have that ignition with the gunpowder, and with rocket launchers, with artillery, that was much the same. But the problem is, the more and more you increase this power of this explosion down at the base, the more and more damage you're actually doing to the rocket launcher itself. And so at a certain point, every time you make one of these rocket launchers, you just fire it once and the rocket launcher just basically explodes. And so the Germans thought about this, and they took the idea from the French, and that was to, instead of just feeding the rocket launcher with a single explosion at the base, to instead feed it multiple times through multiple chambers with multiple explosions. And so soon the Germans had built a prototype and then a regular type, and that culminated in these huge underground firing stations. Like, it wasn't just a gun, it was an entire underground base responsible for firing these projectiles. And that meant that, unlike the Paris gun, which could be angled, you know, in different ways, in different angles, it could be moved around, it could be changed, these V3 guns were permanently fixed into the ground and at a certain angle. And that angle, that trajectory, that aim aim was pointed directly at London. And these V3 guns had a range of around 103 miles, which was roughly 30% further than the Paris gun. But sadly for the Germans, very happily for the Brits, this gun, or rather these guns, were never fired. And I did say these guns because the Germans initially planned 50 of these, all built together, and for them to fire around 300 shells an hour, or just one every 12 seconds, directly onto London. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which would have just been absolutely insanely destructive, and Britain may very well have had to relocate a bunch of people from London to a more northern city. And that was because unlike, air raids, unlike regular shorter range forms of war or forms of attack, there was really no defense against these shells. They came in from such a long range, at such a speed, you couldn't really shoot them out of the sky, and you couldn't intercept them with planes or anything like that. The only thing you could do was move out of their path or go underground or something, but with one landing every 12 seconds, they would have probably just had to abandon London. But as I said, thankfully for the Brits, these sites were abandoned, as by this time Germany started to lose the war. These sites were also bombed by British planes, which basically collapsed at least the top of them, meaning they were unusable. They had to be fully repaired in order for them to work, and the Germans couldn't do this because they were losing France, they were soon going to lose Germany, and maybe if they had done these at the start of the war, if they had that sort of technology, this possibly could have won them the war against the British. But this late into the war, it was, sadly for the Germans, a little ineffective. And so yeah, once again, an insane feat of engineering by the Germans. They honestly just made the craziest, most advanced weapons. Like, if you'll remember the sun gun from the last Iceberg, which was like a space laser basically. So I think when it came to engineering, when it came to manufacturing things, they were completely dominant. But they were obviously outmatched in many other ways by many other countries during the war, in terms of, total manufacturing output. Like, there's one story I remember about American tanks, where you had the German tank was like, in some cases one of the best tanks in the war, and then you had these small American tanks. I think they were called Shermans, but there was a German soldier or commander who was quoted as saying that our one German tank was worth as much as 5 American tanks. But the problem was the Americans always had 6 tanks. So yeah, the Allies definitely won the war of attrition, but the Germans definitely had the upper hand in engineering and rockets and, all that sort of stuff. ME-262. So coming back to German engineering, the ME-262 was the world's first jet fighter. And the amount of world firsts that the Germans ended up inventing and producing during the World War, during the Second World War, is just mind-boggling. And even though the Allies did eventually have their own jet plane, being the Gloucester Meteor, the ME-262 was faster than that one. It was more heavily armed, meaning it couldn't really be attacked or contested, at least while in flight. And so the Allies often targeted the ME-262s while they were, on the ground, or while they were taking off or landing or not in use or what have you. But yeah, once again, just an amazing feat of engineering. Anti-tank dogs were just absolutely bonkers. And as you can imagine, as you can picture, I'm sure, these were dogs trained to carry anti-tank explosives on them and then to run out and to seek out tanks and run underneath them. And then these dogs with the explosives would obviously just explode, destroying the tanks and killing everyone inside them. And once again, as always, let us all say a prayer for those poor dogs. And they were mostly used by Soviets, with the dogs initially being trained to run up to German tanks and to deposit a bomb that was on a timer, and then to get away and then, kaboom. So everybody wins. I mean, except the dogs and the Germans. But these timed bombs were soon replaced by impact-triggered bombs, as these were typically deemed more reliable. And dogs are just honestly amazing. The original plan of the bomb on a timer was the dog would run up to the tank, and when it got there, it would, with its teeth, it would pull this this little belt strap, which would basically, drop the bomb on the floor, and then the plan was for the dog to run back to its owners. But as I said, it was sometimes a little hard to train the dogs to do this effectively, and in live environments with bullets and shells going off and exploding everywhere, the dogs would often run up to the tanks, they would get confused, and then they wouldn't pull the strap, they would just, the training would kick in, and they would run back to the men with this bomb still strapped to them, and the timer would go off, and it would sometimes just kill the dog along with the owners. But yeah, with this new method, they attached a little wooden lever onto the backs of the pouches, and when the dogs crawled under the enemy tanks, like if you can imagine, this is the bottom of the tank, and the dogs would run underneath it, which would pull back the wooden lever, and this would trigger the bomb, and then while the dog was under there, the bomb would immediately just go off and hopefully destroy the tank. And there were around 40,000 dogs deployed in the Red Army around this time, with many of them being tank dogs, or anti-tank dogs. I think tank dogs would be something else entirely. And while the use of anti-tank dogs declined quite rapidly after World War II, the Soviets and Russia didn't officially stop using them until 1996. Axis Sally. So if you'll remember from our last Iceberg, we mentioned the story of Tokyo Rose, which was the name that the Allied soldiers gave to these women speaking on the radio in the Pacific. And they were spouting Axis propaganda, trying to demoralize the US troops, and one of the ladies who participated in it, somewhat against her will, was Eva Taguri Dakinyo, who was a Japanese lady born in America and so was an American citizen. And so after the war, she was convicted of treason against the United States. This was later overturned and she received a presidential pardon. But the story of Axis Sally was very much the same thing. This was regarding a woman named Mildred Gillers, who was born in Maine in the United States of America, and when she was just 34 years old, she moved to Berlin, Germany, which, terrible timing. At the start of the war, she got a job as an announcer for the German state radio. She was paid very well, and when the US started telling its US citizens who were living in Germany, they were telling them, look, return home, it's not safe there, Mildred refused because she had a fiancé, a man named Paul Carlson, who said that he would never marry her if she returned to the United States. And Carlson, shortly after this, was sent to the front lines and died in action. So Mildred didn't have to worry about that, but she stayed in Berlin anyway, and during these broadcasts, she was a little more political and to the point, I would say, than Tokyo Rose. And she would spout just hatred about Churchill and Roosevelt and against the Allies, and use the, usual method of saying, like, to all of the men listening, all of your women, your wives, your girlfriends, they're all probably cheating on you back home while you're off to war, just really in an attempt to demoralize the men. And this was all in a greater attempt to help the Germans win the war effort. And she basically kept up this broadcasting up until just 2 days before the end of the war, and she was then soon arrested, charged with 10 counts of treason. She was stripped of her US citizenship. She was made to pay around $135,000 in today's money, and she was sentenced to between 10 and 30 years in prison for treason. And in 1961, after just 12 years in prison, she was given parole, she was released, and died 27 years later in Columbus at the ripe old age of 87. Hexen Kartathek is, I would say, a rather short entry, but it was a special project in World War II started by Heinrich Himmler, where he proposed that the witch trials used by the Catholic Church had actually been a way by the Church to eliminate German heritage and to exterminate Aryan womanhood. And so this investigation/project was started, and over 9 years, they were supposed to produce a propaganda book or leaflet showing everyone, like, look, the Catholic Church was trying to erase us. But it never really got that far, and the book itself was never produced. The Nobel Prize dissolved in acid. So I absolutely love this entry because I am a bit of a science nerd, but this refers to two Nobel Prize winners for physics, Max von Laue in 1914 and James Franck in 1925. And they were vehemently against the Nazi regime, and so early on they had sent their Nobel Prizes, which were made of gold, over to Copenhagen in Denmark for safekeeping. As, you know, they knew that the Nazis were collecting gold, they likely would have just taken these Nobel Prizes, melted them down, and so, for now at least, they were completely safe. But when Germany invaded Denmark in 1940, a man named George D. Hevesy, who was working at the institution where the Nobel Prizes had been sent to, he knew that the Germans would once again seek out and take any gold they could find. And since it was illegal at the time to send gold out of Germany, George was afraid that the Nazis would find these medals and then punish von Laue and Franck for sending away their gold medals out of Germany. So he didn't want to hide them, as he thought that they might be found anyway, but he did decide to use his incredible skill as a chemist to basically melt them down or dissolve them completely in a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acid. And when it was melted down, he kept it in this jar on his shelf, and when the Nazis searched his lab, they just saw all of these jars of like random colored liquids. You know, there's a blue one, there's a clear one, there's an orange one, and they thought nothing of it. And then after the war, George reversed the chemical process. He got as much of the original gold back as he could, and then they remelted down this gold, they recast them into new Nobel Prizes, and after going through a little bit of a chemical journey, these brand new solid gold Nobel Prizes were once again presented to Franck and von Laue, which it's just such a cool story. The Oka rocket planes were these quirky little planes/rockets that the Japanese used, and they had a very short range, and so they had to be launched and carried on the underside of often much larger crafts. And that larger craft would, you know, fly around, and when it was in range, it would release these plane rockets, and then they would fly down towards their destination or their target. And these Oka planes, they had their own propulsion system. They flew incredibly quickly, and they would fire their 3 fuel rockets at the target and then aim to crash into the target themselves, causing absolute maximum damage. They were also obviously, you know, man-powered or man-mounted or man-controlled or whatever. So in typical Japanese fashion, the pilots would also die in these crashes, and they were incredibly not very effective. They did destroy about 6 Allied ships over the course of around about a year, and the Allies used to call them Baka bombs, with Baka being Japanese for basically fool or idiot. Because yeah, blowing yourselves up in attacks like this was to the Americans just an incredibly silly way to launch attacks. But for the Japanese in World War II, this just made complete sense. Liberty steak was a term used in the US during World War II and I to refer to hamburgers. And this was in an attempt to remove the Hamburg part from hamburgers, you know, since the name comes from the city of Hamburg in Germany. They also tried to call sauerkraut Liberty cabbage. German measles, which, you know, is an actual disease, was renamed to Liberty measles. And there was also a push to remove German composers, so, you know, Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, from national radio and from school programs. So yeah, all in all, I think a little bit silly. There was also the move much later in 2003 for the term French fries to be replaced with freedom fries. And this was in protest to France's refusal to join in or to support the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So yeah, I don't think any of these terms really caught on with the people. Most people just didn't really care. They just tended to stick with what was natural for them. And so I'm pretty sure not really too many people ever called them Liberty steaks. The 1943 Pinsk prison raid. Was one of the most daring raids and prison breaks, I think, in the entirety of World War II. And the goal of this raid was to free a member of the Silent Unseen, the special paratroopers. And it wasn't just one man they were rescuing a few important people, and they were all captured and held in Pinsk prison, which was a heavily guarded, heavily fortified prison in eastern Poland. At the prison, there were around 3,000 men stationed. There were armed guards, there were sentries, all of that good stuff. And the men, this small team of 16, they also only had a limited time and opportunity to plan this raid and to carry it out. And so soon, everything had been planned out. The men all got into a total of 3 vehicles. They then arrived near the prison. They had one of the men dress up as a SS soldier. And while they were carrying out the raid, they all decided to speak exclusively in Russian. And this was to make the Germans think that the Russians were behind this attack and not the Polish. Because they knew that if the Germans knew or even suspected that the Poles were in on this, they might just start retaliating and bombing random Polish villages just out of pure vengeance. And so one of the cars pulled up, the SS officer got out of the car, he ordered the guards to open up the gates, which they did, and then the guy dressed up as the SS officer, he went into the guards room to the guy opening and closing the gate, and he shot him dead. And then the second vehicle came in, the men started entering the office area, cutting telephone lines, they shot 2 more guards, they secured a bunch of keys, and started opening all the cells, screaming all the while in Russian, "In the name of Stalin, you are free, get out." And the prisoners were freed, around 40 Polish soldiers. They all made it out, and it was really a good few hours before the Germans even knew about this raid. And this was at least in part due to the phone lines and the communication lines being destroyed. And while they did at first believe this was carried out by the Russians, they did fairly quickly catch on to it actually being the Poles, and so in turn they shot dead 30 Polish captives within the prison. The Banka Island Massacre was a horrific event in 1942 when the Weiner Brook left port in Singapore just as the Japanese started to attack. And it was basically fleeing from the Japanese. It had on board many British and Australian soldiers and 22 Australian nurses. And it didn't quite get away, sadly, from the Japanese attack. It was bombed, it ended up sinking, and around 100 of the people on board managed to float safely on rescue boats to this particular shore of Raji Beach on Banka Island. And since the Japanese occupied this island, the crew and soldiers and nurses all decided to just surrender to the Japanese. And then they would, be taken as prisoners of war and just likely stay here until the end of the war. So the Japanese came, they rounded everyone up, and they got the men to do a walk a little ways up the beach and around a corner. And when they did, the Japanese had a machine gun set up, and they just started shooting everyone. Many of the men tried to run, but all except one were killed. And that was a Royal Navy stoker by the name of Ernest Lloyd. And he was shot as well, but he managed to run, escape into the sea, and then eventually he completely lost consciousness. But even though he was completely unconscious in the sea, he still managed to survive, and when he woke up, he had found himself washed up on the other side of the beach. Then, after the men were shot, the Japanese came back for the nurses, who most of them were immediately, intimately assaulted, shall we say. And then they were made to wade into the water, and when they were waist deep, they too were all shot. And then these Japanese soldiers went to the other soldiers, the ones who had been badly injured and were on stretchers, who the nurses were taking care of, and they went up to all of them and bayoneted them to death. And as with the men, all of the nurses were killed, except one, who was a nurse by the name of Bullwinkle. And despite being shot, she lay just in the water motionless. She pretended to be dead, and then when all of the Japanese left, she swam back to shore and she crawled into a bush and passed out for a few hours. And when she woke up, she went to the scene of the massacre and found that one of the soldiers who had been bayoneted was actually alive. And so one of the soldiers who was shot was still alive. One of the soldiers who was bayoneted was still alive, as was one of the nurses. And this nurse, she nursed herself and the bayoneted soldier back to, I wouldn't say health, but she took care of their immediate injuries. She bandaged them up a little bit. And also it was around this time that they met with Lloyd, the soldier who had drifted to the other side of the beach. And they all agreed that, again, they should probably just surrender. For sure, they surrendered the first time and they were mostly all killed, but they really didn't have a choice at this point in time. They were all wounded, out on a beach in the middle of nowhere. They would soon die anyway, and so, better to surrender again, hope to find instead a more reasonable Japanese group. And so that is what they did. They all surrendered, and thankfully, they were taken as prisoner of war or prisoners of war. But Gordon Kingsley, who was the soldier who was bayoneted, he died before making it to the prisoner of war camp. So yeah, a completely brutal, completely unnecessary massacre, just absolutely a war crime on unarmed soldiers who had already surrendered, on unarmed nurses, and as far as we can tell, none of these soldiers, the Japanese soldiers, were ever punished for this war crime. And there is at least some evidence to suggest that the Australian government actually tried to cover this up, because after the war, they wouldn't let Bullwinkle, who was the nurse, they wouldn't let her talk about it or mention it, because they said, we're dealing with it. We don't want it to cause perhaps any racial tensions after the war. The war's all over now. It's all said and done. Just don't bring it up. None of this was really in the public knowledge until it was discovered and researched and kind of pieced together by a man much later writing a book about it. So yeah, thankfully, it, actually came out, but it really was just an insane, absolutely unnecessary war crime, which for the most part went unpunished. Teruo Nakamura. Now, as you might recall from the previous Iceberg, the story of Hiro Onoda, who was the Japanese soldier who still believed the war was active and stayed for 30 years in the Philippines, but this case was much the same story. So Nakamura was an ethnically Taiwanese man and he could neither speak Chinese or Japanese, but he joined the war on the side of Japan and he was stationed on Morotai Island in Indonesia. Then the Allies fought for the island in what was called the Battle of Morotai, and in 1944 they took control of the island from the Japanese. And at the time, unable to be found, Nakamura was declared dead. But he wasn't dead, in fact. He remained on the island with a few other Japanese soldiers, and they remained there well into the 1950s. And in 1956, he went off on his own, he built a small hut for himself, and he lived there for almost 20 more years. And he was eventually found just months actually after Hiro Onoda, making Nakamura officially the last known Japanese soldier to surrender after the end of World War II. So when he was discovered, he was flown back to Japan, but he decided that he wanted to return to his home country of Taiwan, and the Japanese government at first, they paid him a measly sum of a single month's wages for a soldier from the 1940s, even though he had been serving unofficially for, more than 30 years. But after some public backlash, he was soon given some, 8 or 9 years worth of salary, plus a bit more from public donations. And so he had a fair chunk of cash that he could use during his life. But sadly for this story, he then died just 5 years later after returning, and so really spent the majority of his life, a good 30 years kind of at war. He wasn't technically at war, but in his head, he was at war that entire time. The Derl Vanga Brigade was a division of SS troops who were, absolute monsters. And it was said of them that they were the ideal genocidal killers who neither gave nor expected quarter, with quarter meaning basically, they would take no prisoners and they would accept no surrender. It was mostly made up of criminals, convicted poachers, and rough, violent, aggressive men, the worst of the worst, and it was commanded by Oscar Dirlewanger, hence the name of the brigade. It was said that Dirlewanger would often beat and even kill his own men if they upset or disappointed him, and the brigade as a whole was responsible for the deaths of between 30,000 and 120,000 civilians, and that was just in Belarus, and also the destruction of an estimated 200 villages. They took part in multiple massacres and were responsible for some of the worst war crimes in the entirety of World War II, repeatedly committing acts of blind violence and torture for torture's sake, also intimate violence, intimate abuse. They would go after women, after children. They really had no limits. They would set hungry dogs on people, just watching them be ripped apart. They would burn people alive, just for the hell of it. And even the SS was like, damn, we don't want to mess with these people. They are pretty dark and twisted even for us. Operation Jericho was an operation that took place in Amiens, France, in an attempt to free some prisoners who were locked up in a German prison. And the initial attack was honestly fairly dramatic. The British used these Mosquito fighter bombers to fly fairly low and to bomb the outside of the prison. And in these initial bombings, 102 of the 832 prisoners were actually just killed, with a further 74 being wounded and 258 of the prisoners managing to actually escape the prison. And yeah, it was absolutely seen as a bit of a wild thing to attempt and to go through with. Obviously, killing 102 of your own side's men right off the bat isn't ideal, and we actually have images of the aftermath of the attack thanks to a camera being mounted on one of the Mosquito bombers. And some of the testimony from some of the pilots in these bombers was, "I shall never forget that road, long and straight and covered with snow. It was lined with tall poplars, or trees, and we were flying so low that I had to keep my aircraft tilted at an angle to avoid hitting the tops of the trees with my wing. The poplars suddenly petered out, and there, a mile ahead, was the goal. It looked just like the model, and within a few seconds we were almost on top of it." The secret photograph of Auschwitz by prisoners with a smuggled camera. So these 4 photographs, which I may have to blur some of them out somewhat, but these photographs were taken in Auschwitz by some of the prisoners. And we don't know for sure the identity of whoever it was that took them. We have these notes, these letters, which were included with the photographs. And this was when they were smuggled out of the camp, and they basically roughly detail the photographs themselves. They describe what's actually in them, and they describe some of the conditions at the camp and how the photographs were taken and then smuggled out. So one of the men in the camp had smuggled in a small camera, and a few of the men at the time knew about it. So they formed a team of sorts, and they helped each other take these photographs and to shield each other from any vying eyes or from, any of the other prisoners, or especially from the camp guards. They then smuggled the camera out of the camp. The photographs made their way to the Polish resistance, and this is how we know about them today. But as to the identity of the individual who took the photographs, we still don't fully know. Graf Zeppelin was, like many of the old airships, just incredibly cool. Well, until this happened. Because in 1937, the Hindenburg, which was the largest airship ever built, it caught fire and basically exploded. And this was because these aircrafts, how they flew was they were filled with hydrogen, which is an incredibly light gas, which allowed the entire airship to be lifted. But since hydrogen was and still is quite flammable, this can obviously be quite dangerous. And so when the Hindenburg caught fire, it collapsed and it killed 36 people between its passengers and its crew members. And that was basically the end of aircraft travel, or rather airship travel, because after that nobody really wanted to use airships ever again. But the Graf Zeppelin was like the Hindenburg. It was built in Germany, fantastic engineers as always, and it was a really cool airship. It could hold around 36 crew members and 24 passengers, and at the time it was built, it was the longest and largest airship in the world. It was also the first to offer commercial flights across the Atlantic, and was the first airship to complete a full trip around the entire world. They also used it to fly to the Arctic on various occasions to gather research data, and they used it as a worldwide mailing service, like between themselves in Germany and, for example, Brazil. And when the Nazis came to power, they, stamped the Nazi logo on a bunch of these, and they typically also used them for propaganda, which is how we get insane images like this that absolutely look like they are AI, but they are completely real. The Curse of Timur was this rumored curse that cursed whoever opened the tomb of Timur, who was a Turco-Mongol leader who, through his conquest, ended up founding the Timurid dynasty, ruling over Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asia, and is regarded today as one of the greatest military men of all time. And while rumors of the Curse of Timur's tomb had been around for years, in 1941 there was an expedition ordered by Stalin which was to go out to this tomb and to confirm that it was really Timur's tomb, and to open it up and to examine it and study it, for research, for science. And basically, long story short, these local men warned Stalin's men. They told them about the curse, they warned them not to open it. The Soviets didn't really pay any mind to this, and when they did finally open it, they said there was a foul smell from the tomb, and also the lights went out, and also these, various spooky things happened. But more importantly, just a few days later, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. And so, it's come up a few times. Was Stalin really cursed? Was he punished by opening this tomb? Would Hitler ever even have invaded had Stalin not gone on this expedition? Had he not exposed himself to the potential curse of Timur? And, who really knows? But let me know what you think on this one. I think it's quite interesting down in the comments below. Raoul Minot was a man who lived in France in Paris during the Nazi occupation. And starting in 1940, he secretly took thousands of images of various things around Paris, mostly of Nazis, which was actually prohibited under Nazi laws. And to take regular photographs, you needed permission for them, you needed a permit, and it really had to all be, above board. But Raoul didn't really care about any of this. He took some really amazing photos, quite honestly, and he took them with this little Kodak Brownie and developed the images in his workplace, which was a Printemps department store. And at one point in 1942, after 2 years of this, someone basically ratted Raoul out, and he was then arrested by the French police. And from here, he was sent to a concentration camp in Germany, and then to a forced labor camp, and then he was forced onto a death march where they basically, pushed everyone to march just non-stop, more or less, and then they killed anyone who stopped or who refused to walk, and then most of the people just died from exhaustion anyway. And this lasted about 2 weeks. He was eventually freed by the Americans on the 23rd of April 1945, but he died just 5 days later in the infirmary. But we obviously, thanks to him, we have all of these images that he took of the Nazis in occupied Paris, and he did all of this basically in protest, despite all of the risks of imprisonment and punishment. And so yeah, he was a very cool dude, and we got some amazing photographs because of it. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night honestly sounds like a pretty swell operation. It sounds quite zen, like just quite peaceful. You're like, oh, I like cherry blossoms. But this operation was anything but that, because this was a planned biological attack by the Japanese that would, and I can't believe that this was the actual plan, but they would launch seaplanes to the west coast of America, and these planes would deliver the bubonic plague in the form of fleas. You know, they would aim to spread it out over America, and hopefully, the Japanese thought, to do a bunch of damage to the civilians and to the livestock and all of that, which would hopefully force the US, out of the war and would make the Japanese the dominant force in the Pacific. And they had created or developed this plague in Unit 731, which we covered earlier. And as well as the plague, the planes had also planned to drop cholera and typhus and dengue fever and many other deadly pathogens out over America. Like, Jesus Christ, these guys were just absolutely insane. But in the end, it was basically shut down, partly because the Japanese chief of general staff, a man named Yoshijiro Umezu, he was so vehemently against it. He said, look, if bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria. And he said Japan will then earn the derision of the world. So he said, basically, even if we win the war by doing this, the entire rest of the world will hate us like forever. And so it's not even in our own benefit. And so, yeah, the plan was cancelled. Japan ended up making a full surrender just a few months later, but still, some very scary stuff. The Chichijima incident was an incident out of the Japanese-controlled island of Chichijima, and it actually also involved George Bush Sr., as he served as a pilot during World War II in this area. And so basically, the United States was doing air raids on the island. They were trying to attack the Japanese and to take the island for themselves. And in the process, a bunch of their planes and pilots were getting shot down. So a bunch of them were shot down during this particular air raid, but 9 men survived being shot down and were then all quite quickly captured by the Japanese. Well, 8 of them were. The 9th, being George Bush Sr., managed to escape and to swim/dinghy back to American rescue. But the fates of those 8 captured men was never revealed to the public. Until in 2004, when a man named James Bradley was researching for his book Flyboys, A Story of True Courage, and he was trying to find the fates of these men and what happened to them. And what he found was absolutely disturbing. He used these old war crimes trial transcripts and various testimonies from World War II to reveal that these 8 men that were shot down were all captured, and then they were beaten and they were tortured and killed, often with them either being beheaded or impaled with a sword. And then the worst part is many of them were eaten. The sources describe testimony that one of the majors and one of the captains had these men carved up and cooked up for a feast and party in their quarters. And the public never knew about this until James Bradley did his research. And the men behind this cannibalism, Major Syo Matoba and General Yoshio Tachibana, they were all punished after the war for murder and for prevention of honorable burial. But they were never officially punished for cannibalism, as it was thought that this was covered up after the war to, as with the other example of the other case that we covered, just to get things back on track. You know, the war was over, we don't need to bring up any of these old things. There were still a bunch of American citizens who were Japanese in internment camps in America. And after the war, these people, these regular American citizens, they were also treated quite poorly. And so I guess they didn't want to make that even worse than it already was. But it is pretty messed up to think about, and it's wild how close the President of the United States, or the future president, came to being cannibalized on this particular day. World War II era red mercury. So this was a very interesting substance that seemed to be red mercury, as mercury is obviously normally silver or grey, but this red mercury was found supposedly and was being sold on the black market to various dealers, various countries, as an important substance in the creation of nuclear weapons. And the thing is, we don't actually know what this substance was. It was thought mostly to just be a hoax, just to be something cool looking, some red concoction that a few people made up and then sold on the black market for lots of money to people who didn't really know any better. And because of the creation process of nukes at the time, especially being like very, very secretive, very unknown, nobody really would have been able to tell if this substance was legitimately the secret to nuclear or not. The substance would sometimes be sold at the price of $100,000 to $300,000 per kilo. And sometimes the seller would purposefully do like various tricks on the substance, for example, irradiating the substance or the containers to make them seem more radioactive than they actually were. But most of the samples that were seized over the years turned out to be just some regular form of mercury, but with red dye added to it. The turtleback tombs. So during the Battle of Okinawa in Japan, these tombs were used a lot, and the history and symbolism of them is really quite interesting. So Okinawa in Japan wasn't always in Japan. They were their own native people. They were kind of like Taiwan, but for the Japanese. And then eventually the Japanese invaded them. They took over Okinawa. And so they are Japanese today. They do, speak Japanese. They write in Japanese. A lot of them have Japanese names, but their ancestry and their culture and their traditions, etc., are wholly unique. And they are actually closer to Chinese than Japanese. But during the Battle of Okinawa in World War II, there were these tombs called turtleback tombs, which were used for shelter by some of the residents in Okinawa. And the tombs were pretty cool. They were basically family tombs, very special and dear to the locals. They would house the urns of many of their ancestors and family members, and they were both womb-shaped, as they were supposed to represent the womb with the dead going back into the womb, which kind of completes the circle of life, and also turtle shell shaped, as you can see from these. And yeah, the citizens wanted to shelter inside of these, but the US troops also wanted to secure them as bunkers and to mount machine guns onto them. And so there was basically a constant ground struggle for control over these tombs. But either way, they are incredibly beautiful. Anne Frank's diary was changed. So many people, myself included, I think, didn't know about this. And obviously I didn't know about this either until I did know about it, or until I learnt about it. But Anne Frank's diary was changed quite a few times. Firstly by herself, and secondly by her father, Frank Otto. And she and her family went into hiding when she was just 13 years old. And almost immediately she began journaling and keeping her diary. She wrote in it for a year and a bit, and then she overheard on the radio that people should basically keep their diaries written during the war because they might be able to be published. They were a good way of telling, what was going on during the war. And so she got the idea to basically publish her diary. And to do that, she needed to clean it up a little bit, make it read more, slightly more like a narrative rather than just random ramblings. And so, as well as writing, from that point on, she also started to organize and edit her own earlier writings. And she was 15 by this point, 2 years older than when she started writing this. And she noted that the stuff that she wrote when she was 13 was in some cases very childish and immature, and so she rewrote some of the earlier parts. She changed some of the wording and some of the paragraphs around. She entirely removed other parts, and those were her edits. And then the family was captured and was taken to a camp where she soon sadly died of typhus. But the diary was left inside the apartment, and it was safely collected by some of the workers who then gave it to her father, Otto. And he started reading through the diary, which seemed to surprise him a lot, as he said, he was absolutely bamboozled by it. He said he thought he knew his daughter, but after reading through her diary, he realized that he didn't actually know her that well. But after being convinced, he decided to go ahead and publish her diary, but not before editing it even further. And he removed a bunch of stuff that Anne had wrote about her, personal, intimate sort of stuff, because Anne in her original diary was quite forward with all of that, with the changes going on with her body, sometimes in great detail, but this is understandable why a father would not want to publish that sort of stuff about his daughter. So he completely removed all of that stuff, and he also removed and changed a bunch of the stuff about the family. So about stuff Anne wrote about her mother, and of Anne's opinions about her, and about the family, and the state of Anne's parents or Otto's marriage, as well as a fair bit more. And you can find most of the original content, out there. You can compare different versions of it to see what was changed between them, but it is somewhat interesting because I never knew that it had even been edited at all. The plan to drop exploding bats over Japanese cities, or what was called Project X-Ray, was a top secret US plan, or operation, to attach these tiny bombs to bats and to drop them all over Japanese cities, with the plan being that these bats would fly down, they would fly around, and they would try to roost or sleep in little nooks and crannies and cubby holes in buildings, in huts, in sheds, with a lot of these things being made out of wood. And then, these bats would just eventually explode. They would set fire to all of this wood, essentially causing mass widespread fires all across Japan. And they hoped that this pressure would force Japan to surrender. And I absolutely love this line, that despite successful testing, the project was cancelled in 1944 in favor of the atomic bomb. Because yes, that was just a minor upgrade. On the scale of weapons, it goes like bullets, rockets, missiles, bombs attached to bats, like a freaking Phineas and Ferb plot or something. And then, just a tiny little step up from that is the atomic bomb, the largest and most devastating weapon mankind has ever seen. And I think it's just all sorts of silly, but it was an interesting plan that just was never carried out. Hitler was actually a sentient dolphin. Oh boy, are we really doing this? And just typing this into Google, it's hilarious how serious the AI response is. It's like, actually, there's no evidence at all to claim that he is a sentient dolphin. Historical records, biological evidence, and scientific analysis confirm that Adolf Hitler was a human being. Well, I guess that's settled, but I thought I would just end this video and this iceberg on one of the more kooky, one of the more quirky, not too serious entries I saw. But this theory, suggests that Adolf was actually short for a dolphin, and that he got kicked out of art school because he couldn't hold a pencil properly with his flippers, his dolphin flippers, or fins, or whatever they're called. And that dolphins had been planning this attack. They had been planning World War II for 1,000 years from the safety of the ocean. And the plan was basically to start a massive world war and to get all of the humans to kill each other so that the dolphins could take over and rule the world. So yeah, just a light-hearted, silly one, I guess, to end the video on. And it has been a while in between videos, so I do apologize for that. I guess I'm slowly transforming into JonTron, but I have in the background been working on one of my largest and greatest videos ever, which will hopefully be done in another month or two. But regular videos will commence from here on out, with me aiming to do at least one video a week going forward. As always, if you like the video, do like the video, do hype the video, do subscribe if you are not already subscribed. We are trying to reach 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. You can buy me a tea on Ko-Fi if you would like. And if you know of any other incredible or interesting World War II facts, entries, mysteries, or just any other videos or icebergs you would like me to cover, do please let me know in the comments down below. I always do read every single comment you guys make, even if I don't end up responding to them. And so, as always, thank you for watching.